Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream. Just today I saw well, there's been a couple of videos from Sean McDowell's channel actually about science and design and all this nonsense, which I thought we got rid of like 15 years ago. I mean, it never really goes away, but it seems like some of the big apologetics channels are bringing it back. So a response is called for. So I thought I would have a look at this video to start with. Where is it? Here we go. Scientistic says Darwinism cannot explain life. Here's why. So this guy is by the name of Dr. Doug Axe. I don't think I've come across him before, but we'll look a little bit more about his deal a little bit later on. So let's jump right in and see what they have to say.
The evidence for design in biology. Despite claims that Darwin defeated the argument for design, our guest today, one of the leading proponents of intelligent design who has studied or done doctoral research at Caltech, Berkeley, and Cambridge, says the evidence for...
See, guys, they found one. They found someone who's actually has a PhD in biology and has done actual research in evolution or at least related fields, who is a proponent of intelligent design. They found like one of a literal handful in the whole world. So yeah, let's see what he has to say about this matter.
Design is undeniable. That's right, undeniable. He is featured in a movie set for theatrical release called The Story of Everything. He's a colleague of mine at Biola, and we'd invite you to join us because this Tuesday, live at 4:30 Pacific Standard Time, we're going to take your questions. So if you have a challenge or an objection to something shared here, write it in as a comment or email me questions@seanmcdowell.org, and Dr. Doug Axe will be back in person to address those questions. Welcome back to the show.
Great to be here.
So something I've really wanted to know about you, and I think it's a great place to start, is how you became a Christian. Did the design arguments play a role at all, or did you discover them after becoming a believer?
Yeah, I don't think they did. So I was not raised in a Christian home.
Okay.
I probably would have called myself a Christian. We had a Bible at home, but we didn't go to church. My mother started to really feel angst about this as her 4 kids were in their teen years. I was 14 years old. So she was praying, and the Lord really answered her prayers in a spectacular way. Within a space of a few months, we all started going to church. I heard the gospel message for the first time. My parents did as well. I think on 2 different evenings at this church. This was up in the Bay Area, in Walnut Creek, California. My parents were baptized, and then we were all the 4.
Is it just me, or did I miss something in this story? They were sort of nominally Christian, but didn't go to church. And then a mother started praying, and then suddenly they were just going to church. Like, I feel like there's some steps that are missing here. Like, why did they start going to church? Why did they decide to get baptized? I'm not really like, I mean, I guess if he doesn't want to share that, he doesn't have to, but it's a bit weird to share your conversion story and kind of skip the conversion part, if you know what I mean.
4 of us kids were baptized the next cycle around. So everything changed for us very quickly. And then, later on, I was at Berkeley. I was thinking about worldview for the first time because I knew I had a Christian worldview, and I also knew that Berkeley didn't share my Christian worldview.
So he's just not going to tell us why he became a Christian, like more than just a nominal one. I don't know. It's a bit unsatisfying. Am I just the only one who finds that unsatisfying? Like, why didn't he tell us why he became a Christian? And
I thought back, and I can't say for sure, how did I think about evolution before I was a believer? My recollection is I thought it was kind of fluff science. I didn't find it to be compelling. As I said, I believe in God, and I did, but I didn't have any really firm foundation. So it certainly wouldn't have been from a scriptural foundation that I would have rejected it when I was a 12-year-old, say. It just would have been, I gravitated toward the physical sciences. They seemed solid and, irrefutable knowledge comes out of that. And I found, the sort of fossil arguments to be patchy and not compelling. But then this all changed when I actually devoted myself to it. So it started to become a question that was important for me to address.
It makes total sense when you're a college student. You've been a believer maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and all of a sudden you're a Christian in a place like Berkeley. You got to land the plane on some of these questions. And you've come out pretty clearly as a Darwin doubter. So I want to know your doubts now, because you said it originally wasn't really motivated by theology or Bible. Are your doubts now theological, philosophical, scientific? Is it about your job at Biola? If you change your belief, you lose your job. Like, seriously, when you get down to it, why are you a Darwin doubter?
Yeah. So I think it started with this. You know how you get your antenna quiver when you see...
He probably would lose his job if he changed his views about this, by the way, as I'll show later.
An argument that looks like people are being way too insistent upon something, and they're not offering... It looks suspicious to me. Like, these people who are being so shrill at rejecting anything but Darwinism don't seem to be able to give a compelling reason for it. So I think it...
Dude, hardly anyone's being shrill about rejecting alternatives to Darwinism. A, because there really aren't any. And B, most evolutionary biologists aren't in the slightest been interested in talking to creationists about this. I mean, maybe some have been shrill with him. You can imagine why. But we'll talk a bit more about what he's done in his career later. But I don't know. It feels like it's a bit of a self-centered way of looking at things. Like most people who research evolution could not give a stuff about anything that creationists have to say, because to be fair, they don't have anything worthwhile to say. But so I don't know that this shrill argument is that this terminology is really holding much water with me. I think that most scientists couldn't care less.
It started with me being a believer, being very open to Darwinism being perfectly false, but not having examined it very carefully. But then also noticing that the way people are behaving in defense of this theory is very strange. You don't get people defending F equals ma this way. You don't get other theories that I consider to be rock solid. People getting so
you don't get other theories that he considers to be rock solid. Because I was about to say, well, hang on. So there's vaccines, there's global warming, of course. There's a range of like intelligence and cognition and the science surrounding that, which is sort of controversial. There's all sorts of results from economics, of course, which are sort of controversial and people discuss. What other theories are there? I mean, there's young Earth creationists who reject aspects of physics, like radiometric dating, for example. And let's see, what else off the top of my head is controversial? Oh, yes, of course. Mental illness denial, and people who just like say that there's no such thing as mental illness or it's all a big scam. There's huge areas of science which at least some vocal minority rejects for various reasons. Now, I'm guessing he's probably, I don't know what he thinks about global warming, although you can maybe make inferences based on, there seems to be overlap here. But like the idea that there's no other theory in science that has like vocal defenders in response to vocal critics who don't know what they're talking about or are spreading pseudoscientific nonsense. It's not just evolution. There's lots of other theories for which that's true. And even the example that he gave, F equals ma, that's a silly example because that's almost true by definition, like the definition of mass and acceleration with respect to a force. It's not really a theory. At least I wouldn't call it that. But if you give some examples of more specific physical theories like relativity and quantum mechanics, there are people who do and have denied those. It's not usually something that gets much popular attention, but there's plenty of cranks around who have problems with both of those theories. So like, nearly everything you can find someone who has an issue with it for some reason or other. Obviously, the issue of evolution is much more prominent because of socio-political factors in America, particularly. But this is just wrong. This is flat out wrong. There's all sorts of theories that attract deniers and then people who actually know what they're talking about who then defend that theory.
Sort of emotional in the defense of it. And so that kind of drew me to it.
Like being all of alternative medicine.
And then I started reading, and I read books like Michael B. He's Darwin's Black Box. Okay. I read enthusiastically Dawkins' The Blind.
So this is already, so I read Dawkins. But like, did he read some good evolutionary biology textbooks or survey papers instead of like reading pseudoscience when he was already skeptical of it? Basically, he says he started out being skeptical of the theory because, well, I don't really know. He just said everyone, like most people in academia or at universities, believe it. And that seems suspicious somehow. I don't really know why that's suspicious. That's true for a lot of scientific theories. Historical knowledge, there's all sorts of things that a lot of people believe. So somehow something being widely believed, at least in the academy, made him suspicious of it. And so then he started reading creationist books. Like this doesn't really, already I'm getting the sense that this isn't really a very honest intellectual process. He had an issue with it for some reason. Maybe it was theologically motivated and he just didn't realize, or perhaps there was some other factors, idiosyncratic, or who knows, he's not really saying. But he seemed to have this bugbear of evolution. And so when he was in college, he started reading creationists. And, well, where did that lead?
And watchmaker. There's this other Australian guy I'm blanking on.
Michael Denton?
Denton. Yeah, I read Denton's book, Evolution of Theory in Crisis.
Yep.
And as I was moving from undergrad to grad, so I was now at Caltech as a grad student, I started to read everything I could about this. And I started to wonder, what's missing here? Because when I'd read these books that were contra Darwin, like Dennett and Behe, I felt like these are strong, but there's something that could be even stronger that they're not, because they're drawing on what we already know. And I felt like, can we go out there and find some things that we don't know and actually figure this out in a more convincing way? And that really led me to embark on a research project where I thought, okay, if you had the money and the opportunity, what would you do to try to solve this thing, resolve it one way or the other?
That's a great way to put it. I think about my life that way sometimes. Like if money was not an issue, what matters most? It sounds like this issue in your life, studying microbiology, you had to settle some of these questions.
Yeah.
But if I heard you correctly, you said you're happy to reject Darwinism, but did you feel like if you embraced some kind of evolution that was threatening your Christian faith? Was that a piece of it to you or not really?
My faith was rock solid. So I knew I was saved by the blood of Jesus and nothing else. I believed Scripture to be reliable, but I could also see how, Genesis is not trying to be a textbook, is not trying to give a scientific account. So I think I had an openness to, okay, how did God do this? And it could have looked like different things.
I don't know whom you're quoting here, Dovrov, because I don't know what a 5-star breeding is with respect to a biologist. So that's a bit of an odd quote. But yes, we'll talk about his academic credentials a little bit later.
I rejected just a raw materialism or the idea that just nature can do this. But what it would have looked like and whether there would have been a tree of life or not, I was open to those things. And that's what made me just plunge and say, well, if I could get rock solid data on one thing, what would it be that I think would really decisively determine this? And that's what I set out to do.
So we're going to jump into your book, but one more question. Did it ever cost you anything, like a relationship or your career or a grade on a paper, to push back and challenge some of these ideas? Or was critical thinking welcome in the academy in your experience?
Yeah, that was a bit of a surprise. So it cost me my job at one point. So I was in the UK.
Oh, right. So they're reviewing one of his creationist books, 5-star breeding. Oh, dear. Yes, we will get to that. So Axe is probably one of the best, like most qualified people that the creationists can come up with. And in some sense, he does have qualifications, but he's not all that he seems. So we'll see.
Okay.
We'll see later.
This was back in 2002. I was working at the Medical Research Council Center in Cambridge. The head over the center was Sir Alan First, and I had a good relationship with him. And he knew that I was actually being funded. At one point, I was being funded by Discovery Institute. He knew that. I wasn't hiding the funding source. But I also was not coming out and saying, you know what, I'm trying to show convincingly one way or the other whether molecular Darwinism can work. What I did instead was say, I'm working on the protein structure function problem. So I'm looking at how mutations affect proteins. This is all legitimate work. In other words, I didn't reveal...
This is all legitimate work, as opposed to what? What do you mean it's all legitimate work? Oh, the bit of a Freudian slip there. It's almost as if he's saying that if it was something funded by the Discovery Institute, which was like trying to show creationism, that wouldn't be legitimate, which of course it wouldn't be. But anyway, that's a funny way to describe that.
Why I was going about this. Okay. And I had a feeling that if things got controversial, that my position could be in jeopardy. And that did happen in the spring of 2002. It happened because there was a school in the UK teaching intelligent design, publicly funded school, teaching Darwinism and design, and got hugely controversial. It was debated in the House of Commons. Tony Blair was prime minister at the time, and BBC Radio was picking this up.
It always annoys me when they talk about this. I don't know of this specific case, but they say teaching intelligent design, but they never say where it's being taught, because typically people like me who are very against the teaching of creationism or intelligent design in high school science classes don't have an issue with it being taught in like philosophy or religion class as a worldview or a belief that, people have had because of faith, or that's, evolved from religious teachings or whatever, or interpretations of the Bible. That's perfectly fine. In fact, I think people should learn about this, but it shouldn't be taught in science as if it were science, or as if it were as if it had the same epistemic standing as evolution by natural selection. So given the controversy, I'm guessing it was taught as science. But the point is that that's an important distinction. And I think that it's unfortunate that that's often, this is not as a politically salient topic as it used to be, but it should be emphasized that the objection of people like me is pretty universally that it not be taught as science, not that it can't be taught in any other context, because obviously it's important to learn about different belief systems, including all the false ones.
I've been doing all these things on ID, this horrible subversive idea that's trying to infiltrate education. That's the way they were portraying it. And
because it was trying to masquerade as science, which it's not. It was a religious belief, a particular interpretation of the Bible that was pretending to be scientific when it had absolutely no scientific basis at all. It was a pre-established conclusion that didn't have any support, and that was at odds with a wide range of scientific evidence, and that it was trying to influence the culture and society by putting it in science classrooms where it absolutely did not belong. And that was the problem. The problem was not that people were learning about this belief. The problem was the way in which it was being taught, or in which its advocates were trying to have it taught.
First came into the lab. I was the only one in there early in the morning one day, and he was twitchy and nervous. He'd been listening to this thing on BBC Radio. Whoa. And he was asking me, like, do you know Bill Dembski? I said, yes. And he walked out. We had a short conversation. I could tell something's going to happen here, and it might not be good. And it did end up, he didn't contact me, but his assistant contacted me with an email saying, "We've run out of space. We need you to leave." And I was like, if not the most senior person there, I was close to it.
Goodness.
So I knew that not only was I losing my position, but he wasn't being frank with me about why. And we're on good terms. So since this, I've had a conversation with him. So we're on good terms. And I've even said, I think I said in my book, I might have removed me if I'd been in his position. I might have removed me as well. But I think I would have done it I think I would have had the honest conversation about either you need to change your project or you need to change your location. He would have been totally within his rights to do that. I just didn't like it.
Yeah, I mean, if a student working with me was promoting something that was errant pseudoscience, I don't think I'd want to work with them. But I do think that you should have had the conversation and not. I mean, assuming that the way he told the story is accurate, if his accounting is accurate, then I think that the conversation should have been had. But anyway, it's a minor point.
It happened.
Well, that's understandable. I'm glad about two things. Number one, that you're on good terms with him. And number two, that was part of your journey, getting you here at Biola, doing a great job.
Yeah.
So obviously not in the route you would have picked, but we're thrilled to have you. Let's jump in your book. It's called Undeniable, which is a bold title, which we will get to.
All right. I think that now might be a good time to have a bit of a look at this guy's career. So what he told us is that he studied in, well, I can't remember which university he mentioned. We can have a look at that now, though, because I have his CV up here. Let's see. Can I add? I'll just do it this way. Huh? Oh, okay. Sorry, can't use a mouse apparently. I have his CV here. Let me turn it off dark mode because it looks a bit weird here. So let me just check. You should be able to see that all right. So let me just check. Where did he do his undergrad? Yeah, okay, so it was UC Berkeley. Then he did a master's degree in biochemical engineering. So he said that when he was a student, he first had, and he was already a Christian by that time, he first had issues with evolution. He didn't really explain why, other than just saying kind of everyone in the academy believed it, and that was suspicious. That seems like a really stupid reason to doubt something to me. And then he started reading a bunch of creationist works. So then he did a PhD in biochemical engineering at Caltech. And his thesis was about the kinetics of RNA polymerase beta subunit synthesis and acid end product transport in E. coli, which is a bona fide molecular biology topic. So what I wanted to show is then what he did after that. Here we go. So here's what's really interesting from the point of view of him as a scientist or a researcher, which is what he's being presented as. So in the sense that he has a PhD from a legitimate institution in a relevant science, then it's fair to say that he is a scientist, right? But I personally think that there's more to being a scientist than just having the qualifications. It's also that you're actively doing science, right? You're publishing in journals and or conferences, work that is reviewed by peers and things like that. And that's where I have a bit of an issue with the presentation here, because let's look at his CV. So his PhD was 1990, if I recall. So you'd expect publications to be coming around this time. So we've got, having trouble seeing my cursor for some reason. So we've got a publication here in 87 and then a bunch in 94, 95. A little unclear why there's that gap there. Just making sure I got the dates right here. You'll see why I think this is important in a moment. I want to explore how he got to where he is. Where's his education here? Yeah, it was 1990. That's weird. I don't know why he has so long a gap between his publications. What was he doing? Yeah, he was a postdoc. That's a long postdoc at Cambridge. So we went to Cambridge after his PhD. Yeah, I don't know why there's not. You'd expect more publications during this time. Maybe it was different back in the 90s. I don't know. But anyway, the main point I wanted to make is that he has a bunch of legitimate scientific publications here. So this one here, where was it? Yeah, here in 2004, estimating the prevalence of protein sequences adopting functional enzyme folds. So this is one of the papers that was sort of controversial. It was featured, as it mentions. It's interesting that he highlights this. Was featured in the documentary "Expelled: No Intelligence Allowed." This was published in Journal of Molecular Biology, as a number of his previous papers had been. So that's a very prestigious journal. That's a very like mainstream prestigious journals, so nothing suspicious about that or anything. And as far as I can tell, this is all perfectly good work. But what I want to emphasize here is that he's working as a postdoc in Cambridge during the 90s. He's got a bunch of publications here, up till this one here, which was sort of the one that was has probably received the most attention of all his work. And it was in 2002 that you recall that he was fired from that job, or at least that's what he says, because, oh, okay, yeah, he went from Cambridge then to, well, this is also in Cambridge, but the Medical Research Council Centre, so a different job, but still at Cambridge. So yeah, 2002, that's when he left that position. Oh, and then he went to a different structural biology lab. That's interesting, and he was there for 2 more years. And then it was after that that he founded this institute called the Biologic Institute, which is basically a creationist organization. And he also founded this journal called, does it mention that here? The name of this journal that he founded? It doesn't, yeah, here it is, Biocomplexity. So this is a creationist journal that he founded around the early 2000s. So what I want to emphasize here is that this paper here, 2004, so that would have been one of his last work as a postdoc. After that, there is essentially, so in the last 20 years, as far as I can tell, he's published essentially nothing of any scientific value. So I don't really know what this is here. The language of proteins revisiting a classic metaphor with the benefit of new technology. This is some sort of symposium, I guess. That's not a publication. There's this +1 paper here, which seems to be something, I haven't looked that up, but this is some sort of technique-based paper. And that's the last one I can find. Everything after that, Biocomplexity, Dembski, this is a book, Biocomplexity. So Biocomplexity, remember, that's his creationist journal that he founded. Discovery Institute, Biocomplexity, this one, what's this one here? I don't recognize the publication, but this is another creationist publication here, Biocomplexity. This one here is another creationist work, some sort of book, Theistic Evolution, a Scientific, Philosophical, and Theological Critique. Actually, yeah, I've been meaning to look at that one. Some known characters there, Morland, Meyer, Grudem. Let's see. Then we've got Guide to Science and Faith, more Dembski. This one here is another edited volume from the Discovery Institute, and Biocomplexity. So what am I getting at here? In the past 20 years, he's published essentially nothing except like, with the possible exception of this +1 paper here, which I'm not quite sure what that's about. He's published essentially nothing at all of any scientific value. It's all just creationist stuff, most of it in his own, either from Discovery Institute publications or his own creationist journal, this Biocomplexity journal here. So he used to do good scientific work when he was working as a postdoc in Cambridge. But after he left that position, or shortly thereafter, he stopped doing any actual scientific work that's published in a reputable scientific journal and started being a creationist shill. So this is why I would say he used to be a scientist, but he's not anymore, because he doesn't do science anymore and hasn't for a long time. So it's kind of unfortunate that he has the skills and education to do this, but chooses to use it for essentially no good purpose. But obviously, you know, he's in a good position to be a shill here for creationism because he actually has the qualifications to do it with. But anyway, he hasn't actually published that much for, I mean, in my view, even in the amount of time here that he was working from his PhD right through to the end. I don't know. Depends how impactful these papers were, but personally, I don't regard it as a particularly impressive amount for the amount of time that he was working. But anyway, maybe that's me being judgy. But certainly he's not doing that sort of work anymore. And these days he's at Biola, apparently shilling for creationism and writing these books. So that's what he's doing, and that's his background. So he's going to tell us a bit more about the work that he did as a postdoc, particularly this issue with the evolution of protein structure and function, which is the basis for like his unique take on why Darwinism is wrong and things like that. So let us go back to the video.
But the chapter 1 in your book is titled The Big Question. So what do you think is the big question, and what's at stake with how we answer it?
I think I put it in the book, to what or to whom do we owe our existence? So
that's right.
Something around that. who are we as humans? How did we get here, and where are we going? You can't ask more important or deep or pressing questions than that.
I mean, I think a more important question like that is how should we live personally, which all of those questions don't directly answer. But anyway,
in philosophy, for sure. But I think those questions are so important that you don't need to be a philosopher to ask them. We should all as humans be wrestling with how do we get here? What are we? And why are we on this planet? What is our life for? And so that's the big question. Questions are around that, I think.
And the question in design directly addresses and leads into those questions.
Because it's how did we get here? And if we are cosmic accidents, if we live in a universe where physics on an Earth-like planet produces life, complex life, and then it evolves to intelligent life, that gives us an answer to how did we get here and what are we really? We are these selected self-replicators that through a long process tried various ways, not intentionally, but sampled different possibilities, possible arrangements, and ended up with an arrangement that looks like us. And we're not here forever. The sun will burn out and we will go extinct. And that gives you one view and a depressing one, in my opinion.
Oh, and there you have. Let me just replay that in case you missed it. Truth spoken.
Up with an arrangement that looks like us, and we're not here forever. The sun will burn out and we will go extinct. And that gives you one view and a depressing one, in my opinion, for why we're here. No particular reason.
Yeah, so he finds this view depressing, which I think is probably the real reason or the fundamental reason why he rejects, why he's a creationist and why he doesn't like evolution, because I mean, as we'll get to later, you don't have to be an atheist to accept evolution. Most Christians do. But because he sees evolution as fitting into a materialistic worldview, which leaves him feeling depressed. And, this is like the classic Craig sob story. I mean, literally, you watch Craig's video where he talks about this, and they have all the animations of people looking depressed and things like that about the fact that the universe is going to, the heat death of the universe will happen in like 100 billion years time or whatever it is. The inability to cope with the relative insignificance of humanity in the universe and the fact that it will eventually end it seems what drives at least some people to accept these sorts of alternative views. So I think it would be better to just focus on that instead of having to have this sort of sideshow scientific or pseudo like quasi-scientific support for it. But, it's convenient to have that as opposed to just saying that I can't bear the thought of humans not being the center of the universe and not having a special purpose in creation. But that really does seem to be the underlying basis of this belief.
How we got here is,
in my opinion,
chance and nature, and where we're going is...
Morning all.
It's going to be an end.
Back to the grave.
Yeah.
This is former molecular biologist and current creationist shill, Dr. Doug Axe, who is being interviewed by Sean McDowell to spruik his new book, telling us why creationism is the way to go.
I think it was biologist Will Provine who said if a materialistic view of evolution is true, not common descent, which you cited earlier that you were initially open to, there's no human value, there's no morality, there's no meaning, there's no human value, there's no life after death. These are the big questions. And
so notice that this is just blatantly the genetic fallacy, that because the facts about where humans came from somehow determine all of these other facts about human value and purpose, which without a lot of other assumptions, they just don't. Like where something comes from in general is not as important for what that thing is and what value that thing has compared to the nature of that thing, right? There's how something is and there's where it came from, and these are separate questions. There may be relationships there to explore, but in general, they're different things. It's a little bit like saying, to sort of borrow an analogy in chat before, it's a bit like saying, well, if my car just somehow appeared or was put together by accident, and instead of being deliberately designed, the car somehow came together by accident. That means it's not really a very good car. It won't really work. It won't be useful to drive me around. But like, that's just obviously wrong. It doesn't matter how the car came to be. The fact is that it is the way it is, and it will still get me to where I want to go. Obviously, cars are designed, but the point I'm making is that it's silly to try to answer a question about something's value or purpose or fundamental nature by just and only focusing on where it came from, because where it came from doesn't change how it is and its, if you like, intrinsic nature or its value. I've never really understood why people this intuition that it's all about where it comes from and where it's going in the very end, as opposed to how it is now. And you really need to explain why you think that the source and ultimate end of something is the be all and end all of what makes it valuable or what gives it purpose, or what that defines what it is. Because it just, on the face of it, is irrelevant.
The heart of it is there a creator, and do we bear the mark of design? Of course, the Bible starts there with, in the beginning, God created.
Yeah.
So you hit at that in your book, which I really appreciate you start there. Okay. So.
Oh, yes. And of course, as I should have said, I don't really know how to read this name. And even if they were right about this, that's not a reason to reject evolution, of course. That's just, well, let's just cope. Feel like, well, I would feel really bad if evolution were true, so we're just going to reject it. So wrong on sort of all levels here, but we'll
let's talk about
going here. Well, I mean, we're supposed to be talking about, this is the title, This Scientist Says Darwinism Can't Explain Life. We're already 13 minutes into 55, and they haven't really talked anything about that. But they always do that in these videos. They always just throw in all this other irrelevant stuff. We've seen, I've done a number of Sean McDowell videos lately, and they don't even try to defend a lot of these claims, and it takes so long to get to the main point.
The prevailing worldview that you're kind of contrasting with is materialism.
Yeah.
Now, I heard you in a conference we were both speaking at recently together. You said this is not the only worldview. There might be New Age worldviews. Yeah. There could be an Islamic worldview. But maybe just briefly remind us what you mean by materialism and how significant you think it is in our culture and in the academy today.
Yeah. So by materialism, I also call it physicalism, which might be a slightly more accurate way to put it. But it's basically the idea that there isn't anything but the physical universe. So the stuff that physicists try to explain and study, that's the sum total of everything. And so if you say, well, what is God then, or what is a human? A human has to be, just by this view, just a physical thing. So what we're doing right now is, to a physicalist, is being directed by synapses firing in our brains. We are, chemical assemblages that are doing what we evolved to do. And it gets controversial when you ask, well, can we trust our thinking if we're just evolved things? And that's a very good question that philosophers have asked.
Great question.
Can we trust our thinking if we're created things? I mean, it's just not obvious that the answer that particularly tells you much of anything. You need to look at our thinking and how it works to tell if we can trust it, not just where it came from. But anyway.
But to a materialist, a physicalist, there isn't anything other than physical. And if you ask them, well, what is God to you? They would say God is an invention of evolved intelligent beings that for some reason we became culturally complex as we emerged from the great apes.
Yeah, like it's I don't know, it's not very subtle. They're just blatantly telling us, yeah, this worldview is scary and upsetting to us. So that's the reason why we feel the need to advocate for these pseudoscientific alternatives. I mean, they could just come out of it and say, look, we're just going to take this on faith because it's comforting to us. And there are some people who say something like that, but that would be more honest rather than then pretending that it's really for these rigorous intellectual reasons, which mostly fall apart on only a few seconds or relatively limited examination. We might get to those intellectual reasons eventually. We still haven't got there yet.
And in order to make society work, we invented religion and God so that there's an authority figure that helps us keep things in order. I think that's what a materialist would say. It's closely wed to atheism, because if you're an atheist, you reject God.
By the way, a materialist doesn't have to say anything about God other than, under most understandings of God, there isn't one, right? A materialist is usually not going to believe in God unless you have a sort of pretty unusual understanding of what God is. But God is usually understood to be outside or transcending the material, or at least not constrained to the material. So the point is, the materialist just had to say, what is God? Well, there is no such thing. They don't have to give a sort of socio-psychological theory as to why we think that there is such a thing as God. They might do so, but the point is, you don't have to take his sort of pop socio-evolutionary account of why we have religion as true in order to be a materialist. That's sort of superfluous. I feel like he adds that in there just to sort of caricature the view as being particularly reductionistic and sort of mean-spirited about religion, because it's really irrelevant to the materialist as defining a worldview. I mean, materialists, again, they don't believe in God. That's really all they have to say about that.
All worldviews need to have an explanation for us. What is a human? And if you reject God, you almost always accept Darwin's theory of evolution. I know one atheist who doesn't, but you're almost always a materialist. And you say, well,
now this is an odd thing to say. If you reject God, you almost always accept Darwin's theory of evolution, because most people who accept God, well, it depends on which country. Like, belief in evolution is quite low in the Islamic world, but in Christian countries, it's most Christians do believe in evolution. US is certainly on the lower side. But the way he phrased it is misleading. He said, if you reject God, you typically accept evolution. But it's also true, at least in a lot of countries, that if you accept God, you also accept evolution. The percentages aren't the same, but the point is, there's no essential connection between believing in God or not believing in God and accepting evolution by natural selection. It's just that most atheists don't care very much. They don't have this theological reason to reject the theory of evolution. He just mentioned he knows one person who does. There are probably others as well. But well, actually, one good historical example is the Soviet Union, which was very hostile to Darwin's views. They didn't reject evolution in terms of like change over time per se, although most creationists say they don't either. But they didn't accept the idea of natural selection. They, under Stalin at least, they advocated for Lysenko's views about inheritance of acquired characteristics, which is a pseudoscience. But that fit more with their well, at least Stalin thought that, and others thought that fit better with the Marxist doctrines that they had at the time. So, you know, it's just that most people who are materialists don't have any particular reason for rejecting evolution, and therefore they accept what our science tells us, which is what most people do if they don't have a particular bugbear reason for rejecting widespread scientific consensus. So the way he frames it here is very misleading. It's true that most materialists accept evolution. It's also true that a lot of, possibly most theists accept it, depending on exactly how you do the survey. But rejection of it for both, for ideological reasons is known both from atheists and from theists. And it really then comes down not to just whether you're a materialist or not, but like, what are your other commitments that you have that would lead you to accept it or reject it? Anyway, so let's continue.
Anything but the material universe. So you're really putting physics in place of God. Physics is the revelation. So if you want to know what the truth is, it's the truth of physics, and the sum total of everything is whatever physics does. So that's materialism. And the reason for most of us, we have friends and acquaintances who are not Christians, but a small fraction of those would be materialist atheists. I venture to guess. It depends on what circles you run in, but I think a lot of people would find, no, my friends are, they like, you know, religiosity. They like Oprah. They like to think in spiritual terms. They don't think of themselves as atheists, or maybe they're Muslim or Hindu. So a reasonable question would be, well, why focus on materialism and atheism if it's not like the number 2 faith on the planet? And the reason I think is really important is because Christianity and physicalism both have a claim to science in a unique way. So
what the heck does that mean? Christianity and materialism both have a claim to science in a unique way. That is just such a word salad. They have a claim to science. What does it mean, a claim to it? And unique from in comparison to what? There's a lot of ways like one could interpret that, but it's just incredibly unclear what he's talking about. And I don't think he clarifies this.
You'll find I found a lot, and I'm sure you run into them too, physicalists, atheists who say, I became an atheist by doing physics, by studying physics. The more I learned about how the physical universe operates, the more I realized that God is superfluous, and the more compelling the case for atheism became. So this may not be the most popular worldview out there, but I think it's really important, particularly for people who have an interest in science, because scientists.
But there are people from every worldview who say that. I mean, I know I debated years ago a Hindu who argued that the age of the universe and the formation of the time of the formation of the Milky Way galaxy was supportive of texts of Hindu texts. Of course, many Muslims argue that science supports Islam. Many Christians argue that science supports Christianity. Pretty sure there are Jews who argue that as well. I haven't heard this from Buddhists, but I'm sure you can find some who do. So like every religion claims this, or I should say there are people in each religion or worldview that claims support from science. I suppose you could do a survey and try to find like what percentage of people from different faiths or worldviews argue that. But again, there's nothing really special about Christianity or materialism here. I mean, at most you might say that materialists tend to be more interested in science than a lot of religious people. But that's just largely because most people who are disinterested in science don't call themselves materialists or physicalists. It's usually like pretty academically minded people who use terms like that. Most people who don't care just say that they have no religion or call themselves agnostic or whatever else. But anyway, I don't really know that he's identified any actual phenomenon of interest here, that there's some particular special relationship between Christianity and Christians and finding their faith through science. I mean, the vast majority of Christians, of course, don't do that. So I just don't really know what the substance is here.
Your textbooks
what he's saying
will encounter materialism or naturalism, which is a slightly nuanced version of materialism, much more often than you encounter other religions, say.
That's a real helpful way to look at it, because if
Wait, what was that last bit that he
in
said?
your textbooks will encounter materialism or naturalism, which is a slightly nuanced version of materialism, much more often than you encounter other religions, say.
That's a real helpful way to look at it, because if materialism or
much more often than you encounter other religions, or naturalism, which is a slightly nuanced version of materialism, much more often than you encounter other religions, say.
Is he saying in the academy you encounter naturalism more often? Because that's certainly true. I don't know why that's important, though.
That's a real helpful way to look at it, because if materialism or physicalism is real, we can see the emphasis on science being authoritative, because scientists study physical matter. Philosophers, theologians, apologists like myself study things that are inventions and they're not real.
Well, but the thing is that most people agree that we live in a physical world. At least that's a large part of the world. Maybe it's not all of the world. And so science is going to be authoritative to that extent anyway. I mean, this is what I always find weird, because Christians believe that Jesus died and rose bodily from the dead. So presumably the fact that God chose to do that and that eventually everyone will be resurrected too is an indication that the physical world is like super important, right? It's not kind of like an optional or incidental extra. It's foundational to God's creation and his role for humanity, and his purposes in creating, right? So anyone studying the physical world or any rigorous study of the physical world will be authoritative. I mean, and this is what Christians usually argue when they say, oh, in the past, scientists studied the physical world in order to glorify God, right? And I think they say this later on. But it's weird, because here they're framing it as if someone who studies the physical world is authoritative only insofar as you think that the physical world is all that there is. But that's just obviously not true. Like, the physical world is important regardless of whether you think there's more to it than that. But particularly from a Christian point of view, it seems like there's something, or from a mainstream Christian point of view, there's certainly something very important about the physical world. God seems really invested in physics as well. So I don't really understand this idea that seems to be framed here as if a focus on the physical and a value, holding science as valuable, is in some way restricted to or reflective of a materialist worldview. Like, it's just not.
And I would say you're right. Probably the vast majority of Americans are not materialists and beyond. It was Christian Smith, sociologist, who talked about moralistic therapeutic deism.
Sure.
There's kind of a God who's out there, but he's not involved in my life, and he just wants me to feel good and be good. But there's a functional kind of materialism or naturalism that's also in the church. I think there's a lot of Christians that, do we really believe in supernatural powers like angels and demons? Do we really believe in the power of prayer, miracles? And so even if people aren't hardcore materialists, these kinds of
hardcore materialists, that's me, and maybe some of you boys, they mentioned us.
Arguments seep down and have an outsized influence in the church and in the culture. Hence, I think it's important to push back. Yeah. So here's what you write boldly, and I love this. In Undeniable, you say, for me, there is no debate. The scientific facts are in complete harmony with the universal design intuition. Now, specifically, what scientific facts do you think best?
I love this framing that the facts are in harmony with an intuition. They're not in harmony with like a theory or an explanation or some facts in line with other facts, but they're just in line with an intuition. And intuition is sort of like the most ephemeral and poorly defined thing that you can have, especially because an intuition can just sort of, it doesn't have to be clearly articulated, and it can sort of readily change with the evidence that's available. So like saying that the facts are in line with an intuition, to me, is just such a useless thing to say. Like, who cares if they're in line with an intuition? What we care about is what should we believe and what's the best supported theory.
Support design.
Well, this is what I started working on as a postdoc, and I was like chomping at the bit as a grad student, thinking, I was at Caltech as a grad student, and I was framing these ideas and thinking, what would I do if I had a lab, if I had money and lab at my disposal or equipment at my disposal? What would I do? What would the one question be that I would address to try to lay this matter to rest? This matter being Darwinian evolution. And I landed on looking at a single gene that encodes a single protein in a bacterial organism, the easiest organism to work with. You can have these genes in a test tube outside of bacteria, and you can manipulate them. You can make variants of them. You can make what they call libraries, so millions of different variants of a gene that have genetic changes to them. Stick them back in the bacteria. All this stuff is routine, much easier than, say, working with mice, much easier than working.
The way he phrases this is odd because, I mean, he studied molecular biology. So, of course, he's going to do work in molecular biology. Whatever.
Doing anything with humans is virtually impossible for good reasons. But you just have to sort of infer things from what genetic mutations you find in humans. Very hard, for good reasons, to do experiments on humans. Bacteria, it's easy. So I thought, I'm going to look at a single gene that encodes. So genes are, it's DNA, it's double helix, A's, G's, and T's. They encode in bacteria in a very simple way the sequence of amino acids that get strung together to make a protein. And a protein is a chain of these 20 different amino acids. If they have the right properties, they fold into marvelously complex shapes, three-dimensional shapes, and they do complex things, like they do chemistry. They can be parts of a motor. They can be scaffolding. So much more complex than Legos, but like Legos, you can build things out of them that makes life, cells. And this is not just bacteria. This is us too. All of life depends upon proteins. But unlike Legos, they're using thousands and thousands of very different forms, whereas Legos, you got your one thing and you stick it together in lots of different ways. These things have complex structures that enable them to do their function. And their functions, all biologists describe them in purposeful terms, like what the role of this enzyme is to do this in this metabolic pathway, because there's just no other way to do it. So my thinking was, I'm going to take
Okay, so let me clarify. You're not trying to explain just the origin of the cell itself. You're focused on a particular protein, which is a part of many proteins that build a cell. So you're kind of starting on what might be considered a simpler task to accomplish.
Yes.
I don't really know that. I don't really know. Well, hang on. Sean McDowell surely read the book, right? Well, anyway, it's not clear to me from his question that he really understands the real issue here, because the ostensive purpose of this research is to determine whether Darwinian evolution is accurate, whether it's a correct theory. The origin of the cell really has nothing to do with that, because Darwin starts with a cell. Like evolution, I mean, you can trace molecular evolution back a bit further than that, but at least starts with some form of life. Maybe not cells that we know it, but some form of primitive form of life. Abiogenesis is a field that studies the origin of life from non-life. Evolution itself doesn't have anything to say about that, like evolutionary theories. Certainly not Darwinian evolution, right? And so the origin of the cell is really a red herring here. It has nothing to do with this. Now, the other thing is that it's entirely unclear to me. Maybe this is about as far as I got in the video, so I'm not sure where it goes from here, but maybe he will clarify. But it's entirely unclear to me what studying a single protein is going to tell, a single protein in a single organism is going to tell you about whether evolution is true or not. I mean, I have some idea about what he found, right? But that's just too narrow an evidence base to address a question as broad as evolution. I don't know how, even if we accept all of the findings that he's going to tell us about, how you can say that that outweighs all of the mountainous evidence that we have in favor of evolution. Hopefully he addresses this, because this is something that makes no sense at all to me, that studying one protein and looking at how its function is changed with changing amino acids, which is what he's going to tell us about, that can tell you something about evolution, but it doesn't just negate all of the other, regardless of what you find, it's not going to negate all of the other mountains of evidence that we have in favor of evolution. So at most, it's going to be a small piece in a puzzle. It's not going to answer the question once and for all in the way that he sort of presented. And it's not even really clear why you would approach it this way, why you would approach answering the question in this way. So it's strange. It's not well motivated as a way of addressing the question that he raised, is what I'm saying. And the origin of the cell just doesn't really have anything to do with this. I don't know why Sean even mentioned it, because Doug didn't say anything about it either. So anyway.
Before you get to the cell and beyond.
For sure. So if you take the simplest bacterial cell would have approaching 1,000 different genes that encode 1,000 different protein forms, all of which are essential for it to do what it does. Now, there's debate over what's the simplest cell. There are some cells that are obligate parasites. They have to live inside another cell.
So these are the simplest cells that currently exist and we know of. That doesn't mean that they're the simplest ones possible, and almost certainly they're not. It's just that simpler ones don't exist anymore, and we haven't yet been able to reconstruct anything that's simpler, but there's work on this. He's sort of mentioning this as well, like how much can you strip away and still have a viable cell? But there's a lot of complexity there, because it depends on the conditions that it existed in, and those conditions probably don't exist on Earth anymore, and may be very hard to replicate in the lab, and maybe takes a very long time. Anyway, I'm not going to get into abiogenesis now. It's not the topic, so I don't know why Sean mentioned it.
If you talk about free living cells, the sort of thing that could just live in a pond or a puddle, they need well over 1,000 of these genes. So that gives you an idea for how many genes and proteins you have to even have very simple life work. And my idea was not to say, I wasn't specifically saying what makes a cell work. I was saying, how did any one of these proteins come about? How hard is it to get DNA arranged in a sequence that produces one of these folded forms that actually works? And so I thought there had been some experiments where people just threw together random DNA and try to see if it does anything. And you can argue, if you don't look for actual structure or function, that it might be doing something very simple. But I thought a better way to do this is look at an existing folded enzyme structure, a protein, and see how delicate it is, how sensitive it is to changes in the amino acid. So I messed up basically an existing enzyme, put millions of these messed up versions in bacterial cells, and let them tell me whether it works or not, because it's the enzyme's function that I chose to work on. It makes bacteria able to survive in the presence of penicillin, which is, that's the famous first antibiotic. You put penicillin on a Petri dish, put bacteria on the Petri dish, they can't survive, they get killed, unless they have this special enzyme that deactivates the penicillin. So I thought, well, I'll mess up the enzyme and let the bacteria tell me which or what fraction of these messed up versions still work, because those would be bacteria that on a plate with penicillin form a colony. And if they don't form a colony, it's because it doesn't work. And that way I could actually get a fraction of these messed up versions that work, and I could start to do math on it. Like, okay, how hard is it for one of these things to work?
Okay, that makes sense. So you're not really studying evolution itself, like biological evolution. You're studying what might be called chemical evolution at its very base, and taking something that already exists, breaking it down. And so in a minute, I want you to tell us what you found, but what would have confirmed in your mind kind of the materialistic worldview? Like if you found this, you would have said, okay, I've got to concede that materialism can explain this.
Yeah, so I'd done some calculations and I thought these protein chains, amino acid chains, are typically hundreds of amino acids in length. I looked at a chunk of one protein that was about 150, so not even a full protein. And if you do the math of how, like say half of the amino acids are fine at every location, then you have kind of like a binary. It's almost like zeros and ones. Did you get it right or not? If 10 work at each position, and it might differ which 10, then it's almost like a binary chain. But even with binary, if you have a long enough string of zeros and ones, you've got a very, very improbable, even a binary string. So yeah, 2 to the 10th power is roughly equal to 10 to the third. So there's about 1,000 ways to arrange zeros and ones 10 long. But if you make it 100 long, you've now multiplied that by a very large factor. So instead of 2 to the 10, you got 2 to the 100 is 10 to the 3 raised to the 10th. So that's going to be 10 to the 30. You now have a very, very rare chain, even if half the amino acids worked at any given location. My suspicion when I went into this is it's not going to be anywhere near half. So I had already sort of spitballed it and thought, I can't see any way that getting proteins is going to be probable.
Right, and there's the crux of it right there. So what he's saying is that even small proteins have like 100, multiple hundreds of amino acids in them. And his work showed, I mean, I presume other people have looked at this as well. Maybe he did it in a different way or in a new context. I'm not sure. But at any rate, his work showed that if you mutate some of these amino acids, like even small numbers of them, then the protein will no longer have the same function. It won't work. So in other words, you need to have a quite precise ordering of amino acids in order for the protein to be functional. I mean, we've known this for a long time, right? And his point here is that if there are 100 amino acids and you have to get them in the exact right order in order for the protein to work, it's incredibly unlikely that that would happen by chance. And he can't see a way to get that to work from evolution. That's the crux of the argument, right? So what there is an apparently unlikely outcome, like the specific ordering of the amino acids to make a protein, and the inability to develop, or the alleged inability, let's say, to devise an explanation that accounts for this using natural processes. So, I mean, you can see where he's going with this, but let's see exactly how he frames it. But what I want to emphasize is that at the moment, all we have is an unanswered question. How is it that the amino acids could come into, or the DNA that codes for these amino acids, how could they come to have the precise ordering that they do when there are so many possibilities? How did that information get there? And what are the mechanisms that led to that? That's a question. It's a perfectly good question, like it's a valid research question, but it's just a question. It's not a conclusion of any sort. And the fact that you can't come up with an explanation is also not a conclusion. It just means, well, we don't know. And often the answer, the true answer to a lot of these questions, open scientific questions, is, well, we don't know. There's people who have different ideas about it, but we're not really sure. And there's no one theory that is overwhelmingly accepted and that really well explains all the evidence. That is just an I don't know. That is not actually a conclusion at this point. But let's see where he goes with this.
And is 10 to the 30 an extraordinary probability, 1 in 10 to the 30? Well, when you consider that the total number of organisms.
Yeah, so I haven't read the particular paper, and if there are criticisms of that, then that's fine. But the thing is, the statement that he's made is not objectionable, because it is true that you need to have amino acids in a precise order, or fairly precise ordering, in order for the protein to function. And exactly how that comes about is an open question. And at that point, at this point, that's really all he's stated. And so, I mean, that's correct as far as it goes. So the details are not even really that relevant here. The question is what he's going to do with that.
on the planet is maybe 10 to the 40th. You're in all of history, you're approaching numbers where there just hasn't been enough opportunity to sample things that could succeed at hitting a target that small.
Let me just, that's important.
Is maybe 30. Well, when you consider that the total number of organisms on the planet is maybe 10 to the 40th. You're in all of history, you're approaching numbers where there just hasn't been enough opportunity to sample things that could succeed at hitting a target that small. So,
no, I've never heard anyone say that before. How does he know what the total number of organisms that have ever lived is? And also, it's not so much the total number of organisms, but it's the total number of cells that's important, because you can have mutations in a single cell. Well, I mean, particularly when we're talking about a single-celled organism, I guess there's no distinction there. But there's also horizontal gene transfer, which can transfer genetic material from one cell to another. And also, you can have there's multiple copies of genetic material in a single cell. And in fact, that's one of the leading explanations of how new genetic diversity does evolve, is by gene duplication events, which then allows for a second copy to accumulate mutations, some of which by chance happen to be useful for another task. Anyway, but I don't know where this 10 to the 40 number comes from. I'm pretty suspicious of that. I don't know how you would really get this number.
But in order for, you asked what could make materialism work, it would have to be that a protein chain almost doesn't care which amino acid goes where, and it will still fold. But that seems so implausible to me, I didn't believe it. There were people at the time that I did this experiment that were arguing that it's almost binary. You just have to have hydrophobic amino acids in the right place and hydrophilic. So that would be binary. Just get hydrophobic and hydrophilic right, and the thing will fold. I quickly found that that was not the case.
Yeah, well, I imagine he's talking about for a specific, he is talking about for a specific protein there, because in some cases it doesn't matter so much. This is a silent mutation where you change the amino acid, or is that when it codes for the same? Yeah, that's when you change the nucleic acid and it codes for the same amino acid. But there's also another type of mutation where it codes for a different amino acid, but the amino acid is functionally equivalent so that it doesn't change the folding of the protein. The thing is, it's always going to be an empirical question specific to each protein as to how many of the amino acids and which of them can be changed to a different amino acid whilst preserving the function of the protein. And I strongly suspect that he's overstating the case here of how many of them can and cannot be changed. And this is one of the points, that there's nothing magical about whether it's a specific amino acid number, like which of the 20 amino acids it is. What matters is its chemical properties. And the chemical properties of many of the amino acids are similar, and not all of them are as important to protein function as any other. So for any protein that has a set sequence, there will be some number of variations that preserve the function, or at least mostly preserve the function of that protein. And in general, we don't know what that is. It's very difficult to assess because there's so many different combinations. He looked at one protein, and someone in chat was raising questions about his specific results. But even if we just accept on the face of it that for that particular protein, it was relatively unlikely. Sorry, there was a relatively small number of variations that would preserve the function. That's not necessarily going to be true for other proteins. So it's a very technical question that needs to be addressed very carefully to assess what is the range of acceptable variation that a protein can have and still preserve its function. And the thing is, function's not binary either, because proteins can start off as having one function and then be co-opted for a different function, and they can also function to varying degrees. So what he is trying to say is that there's a very, very narrow range of protein sequences, amino acid sequences that will preserve function. But that's not going to be a general truth. That's going to depend on the protein in question. It's certainly true that there is some significant amount of specificity. It's interesting he was saying there that some people were claiming that it's just hydrophobic or hydrophilic. That seems to me that can't be true in general, but it may be true in certain cases. I don't know exactly what context he was, like in what context people were saying that, whether he meant in general or just for that specific protein that he was looking at. But anyway, to come back to the main issue, at this point, we still just have an unanswered scientific question. And there are hundreds of unanswered scientific questions, by the way. That's sort of how science works. So at this point, we don't really have an argument for anything. We just have an unanswered scientific question. Yes, and this is what I'm interested in. So let's stop pretending that we actually care about the biochemistry and start talking about how creationism or intelligent design actually fits into this.
It's much more subtle than that. So I came up with a number that's much more scary than if it were binary. It's not nearly that friendly to evolution.
Okay, so tell me if this is fair enough without making it too simplistic. We're dealing with probabilities here, and say we want to spell out the word cat. Well, C first, there's 26 options. And then you get an A, there's now 26 options. So it's 26 times 26. And then the T is 26.
Right.
This is exponential growth.
Right.
At some point, you hit a number that's so big, it couldn't possibly happen by chance. And of course, on the flip side, if we see a complex word like hydrophilic, we for sure know that this was the result of an intelligent mind who spelled it out.
Right.
If we see cat, we go, I mean, maybe there's a chance if the letters fell, it could spell that out. Maybe.
Well, one of the things you say with cat is, well, it didn't have to be cat. It could have been bat. It could have been C. It could have been, there's all these 3-letter words that it could have been, and it just happened to be cat. And you can get a catalog of how many 3-letter words are there? I don't know off the top of my head. There's a lot of them. And if you take 26 raised to the third power, take the number of 3-letter words, divide it by that, it gives you roughly the size of a target that would be needed to, by chance, get a 3-letter word. And you can get 3-letter words. I use alphabet.
Yes, and the disanalogy here is we don't know how many different sequences code for functional proteins. And we also don't know that the process is random for how evolution essentially ordered these proteins, because we don't know. We don't know. I mean, our knowledge of evolution really starts when we already have a very complex cell. So there's not that much known about how the very early molecular evolution happened, so as to select for certain like proteins that had certain amino acid sequences. So we don't know if it's random. It likely isn't random. In other words, that I mean, we know it's not random in the sense that it's not equally likely given one amino acid, then the next one is just going to have a 1 in 20 chance of being any other amino acid, because there's constraints that operate under that. But also, we don't know the process by which the first proteins were produced. So we can't just assume that it is that it was purely random. It depends on how we model it and what assumptions we're going to make. And certainly when we're talking about the very origins of life, or the origins of the first cell, or the first proteins in a cell, then we just don't know very much about that. We don't know about the processes, and it's not necessarily true that every amino acid had an equal probability independently of all of the others. So the point is that the letter analogy is helpful for thinking about the question, but it doesn't. The scenario is not precisely equivalent for the two main reasons that we, unlike words where we can easily determine how many words, like 3-letter words there are, that's fairly trivial. We can't easily determine how many different functional proteins there are for a given length amino acid. And then the second problem is that we don't know that the ordering is actually, in terms of like how the sequences are explored evolutionarily, we don't know that that's random, or at least we don't know that that was random in the early processes of the development of a cell, like the first cells. So, I mean, those are going to be the assumptions that he's going to depend on when making these calculations, but we don't actually know if those are correct.
Soup in my class, and you put a picture of alphabet soup,
Okay.
you can find messy 3-letter words. You start going to 4-letter, 5-letter, 6-letter, small phrases. It becomes just astronomically more improbable because, as you said, you have to multiply these improbabilities along the way.
So how?
Yes, and that multiplication is assuming independence, and we don't actually know that that's a valid assumption for the origin of the first proteins.
Probable is it to get, I think you said 150 amino length chain is like maybe not even quite a workable protein, but let's make the most simple one conceivable. What's roughly the math or the odds? Was that 1 times 10 to 1030, or did I mishear what the number would be for that protein?
For the one I examined?
Forgetting the one, yeah.
Yeah, I was saying 10 to the 30 would be if it were just simple hydrophobic polar 50-50.
Okay,
like,
that's right.
If at each position you had like 50% odds of being okay, then you'd get something like 10 to the 30. I got something that's much worse than that. Okay. And I took a careful account of hydrophobic and polar because it's a little bit complicated, but I made sure that all my chains were all the sequences that I introduced to these bacteria were being hydrophobic where they should be and hydrophilic where they should be. But I let it shuffle within those constraints. And even when you do that, you find that a very substantial majority of amino acids are not good at any given position. Or another way to put that is there's a pretty strict requirement at almost every position. And at some positions, it's very strict. Like it has to be this and nothing else. So I ended up with a measurement that was 1 in 10 to the 77th power, that you would have a string of amino acids that forms a function that's ready to perform, forms a fold that's ready to perform a particular function.
Yeah, so this is assuming that, as far as I can tell from the way he described it, this is assuming that there is a requirement for that specific fold in order to perform that function. In other words, that there's no other folds that would also be appropriate, which may or may not be true. It depends on the protein in question, and like because the space is so huge, it's very hard to know this what subset of possible proteins could perform that equivalent function. So that's one issue. But the other issue, which I think is probably the more pressing one, is that the probability calculation assumes that the the space of possible proteins, I should say, the space of possible amino acid sequences of a given length is explored randomly, in that each, I mean, I said this before, each amino acid is independent. The identity of each amino acid is independent of any of the others. That's how you multiply out the probabilities to get this very small number. But we don't know that that's the right assumption. And I strongly suspect that it's not the right assumption, precisely because there's, I mean, this is sort of one of the problems, is that there's too many possible configurations. Evolution, it seems, doesn't have time to explore them all like one by one. And so there must be some other mechanisms that allow it to more efficiently explore the possible space to find the solutions that actually, facilitate the biological function in question. So I don't know, as far as I know, we don't know the answer to that. What are the mechanisms by which the molecular evolution process explores the different possibilities? But really, all you need in principle is some process that means that where you reject this independence assumption that all of the amino acids are sort of explored independently. And so any process that can do that will dramatically reduce the number of possibilities. So that's what we need to assess. That's what we need to investigate. At the moment, all he's articulated is an open question.
And that's, if you just say, well, how much higher is 77 than 30? Well, we're used to just thinking of numbers, well, it's only double. But no.
Yeah, so this is what I was saying, that he's assuming that there's sort of only one fold that performs this function, but we don't know that. We don't actually know how many different folds would perform this function. Now, it's probably going to be a small subset of all possible amino acid sequences, but we don't know how large it is. But yeah, I think that there's also that the bigger issue probably is this independence assumption, which is usually how apologists get their very tiny probabilities, by the way. They just start with a small probability and multiply a bunch of them together, and then you always get a very small number. So it's sort of trivially easy to do if you assume independence. But that independence assumption is almost certainly not correct. But we don't, as far as I know, we don't know the right way to model this. There's so little information that we have, and so we're still in the process of trying to work out how these first proteins did evolve. So what he's told us here is essentially, well, we don't really know how this happened.
This is the exponent. So 10 to the 30 times 10 to the 30 is 10 to the 60. And that's 17 orders of magnitude smaller than 10 to the 77th. Is mind-boggling. We're not used to dealing with numbers this large. I use a way of illustrating what would it be like to blindfolded throw a dart and hope to hit a target that's one part in 10 to the 77th of the whole, say, wall, or the whole thing that you could hit. And you think, okay, that's a small bullseye on a big wall. How small is the bullseye and how big is the wall? Turns out for it to be one part in 10 to the 77th, it would be a bullseye the size of a hydrogen atom on a wall the size of a sphere enclosing the visible universe. So
I can't even visualize that, right?
These are numbers that are beyond comprehension.
Isn't the number of atoms in the universe 1 times 10 with 80 after it?
So we're approaching like, there's one marked atom in the universe, and that's the jackpot. Go pick an atom and look at it and see if that's the mark.
I always hate these comparisons. So it's not meaningful to compare a number of discrete entities that exist at a point in time to a number of combinations. Because it's not like we have to assign one combination of amino acid sequences to a single atom. We don't know how long it might take a cell to sample different amino acid orderings. I mean, this is another issue, right? If you imagine that you have a cell, I mean, the way that cells currently work is that the genetic material is transcribed from DNA to RNA, which is then translated into a protein sequence. But it probably didn't start out that way. A number of researchers think it probably started out with the RNA, and which then translated to DNA, and then later on was a mechanism developed to reverse transcribe it back to DNA, which is like a more stable storage. But anyway, there are other people who think that maybe the proteins came first before the RNA, but that's because the sequences are related by the genetic code. So that's not the most important thing. The question is how you get the sequence. But the point is, today that's all fairly well constrained biologically. But before all of this evolved, there was almost certainly processes by which amino acids were added in. I mean, this actually still happens, right? That at the molecular level, you have the different like there's 20 different amino acids. There's a molecule called a tRNA which comes in with its corresponding amino acid, and like if it fits in the slot and can bind with the enzymes, then it will be added. But if it doesn't, then it will sort of like diffuse away. And so many different combinations can be tried in a relatively short period of time until one fits in. Some mechanism like that likely was operative, such that the protein was, so whether it was protein or whether it was the RNA, that there was a process of trial and error, essentially, of adding new components to see which folded into a stable and then useful framework. I mean, first of whether it's stable, and then it's whether it does anything. So the point is, I mean, he mentioned before the number of organisms that had ever lived, and I was curious as to where he got that number from. But even aside from that, it's not meaningful to compare a number of combinations to the number of organisms or the number of atoms, because each organism that existed can try many different combinations of an amino acid sequence. Because this happens at a level of like the sub-microsecond level, or maybe microsecond level, but it happens very rapidly that you can try many different combinations. And of course, this doesn't just happen once. This can happen many times within a given cell, because there are many sites of, well, today, like ribosomes, which is where the protein is synthesized. We don't know exactly when this happened in evolution, whether those even existed at the time, but like whatever the mechanism was, there's many of them within a cell, and they can all be trying many different combinations for a long period of time. You need to do the numbers to work out what is the plausible number of sequence combinations that could be tried in a given amount of time in order to happen upon one that does something useful. It doesn't seem like he's done that. All he's done is calculated a very large number and then compared it to irrelevant other numbers, like the number of organisms that allegedly have lived or the number of atoms in the universe. But neither of those are relevant. Really, all that matters is, can we find plausible methods by which early cells or protocells could sample a broad enough range of amino acid sequences in order to find proteins, the sequences that code for proteins that are that serve a functional purpose. Was there enough time to do that? Was there enough like different cells or protocells to have enough like parallel processing, if you like, to like sample all those conformations? And what are the mechanisms that we use to do that sampling? Was it just like literally random trial and error, which would mean that it was that this independence assumption may be more valid, although that doesn't necessarily hold. But like, is this independence assumption valid, or were there other processes that meant that there were other mechanisms that meant that you didn't have to just rely on this sort of pure trial and error, which there likely were, but we don't know a lot about what those might have been in the specifics, right? So the point is, in order to do these calculations meaningfully, you need to consider the process that was used to explore the space of possibilities and how much time existed to do that exploration, and then how many conformations could have been sampled in that certain amount of time with the amount of cells that were around. Comparing it to the number of atoms in the universe has absolutely no relevance at all, because a combination is not the number of combinations of things is not the same as the number of things. You can do this with anything, like the number of different hands you can draw from a 52 card deck is like astronomical, but there's sort of nothing really follows from that, because it's not like you have to assign one draw to one atom in the universe. It's just like most of these draws we won't see, because we only ever sample a subset of them. Anyway, so hopefully that sort of makes it clear that what he needs to establish is that it's implausible that enough combinations of sequences could be sampled in the amount of time that was available in order to find the proteins that are functional. And in order to do that, he needs to know something about the mechanisms by which the sampling occurred, which, as far as I know, are not understood. And so at best, what he might be able to show is that pure random sampling is insufficient, which is probably true, but he hasn't even shown that, because he hasn't presented any calculations of like how many conformations could be sampled randomly and how many would they needed to have done in order to find the protein. All he's saying is that it's a huge number, but the fact that it's huge doesn't actually tell you how many could have been sampled in a certain amount of time. So he hasn't done that other half of it, or at least he hasn't presented that here. Well, we haven't got to the God yet. I'm just I'm trying to explain the science and what's interesting about it, because it is an interesting question. Obviously, eventually we're going to get to God at some point. We haven't got there yet. So I'm just, at most, you could say that this is an unsolved scientific problem, which it is, although I think that he's also not doing a very good job at trying to solve it, or like not explaining it in a very clear way, because comparing the number of combinations to atoms in the universe is irrelevant. And he hasn't told us if it actually is implausible that the space could have been sampled just by randomness, because we don't know how many combinations could have been sampled. He hasn't told us that. But at best, we can agree with him and say, oh, this is a genuine scientific question. We don't know what the answer is. So what do you think we should do with that, Doug?
Which one? We're approaching odds like that. But that's fantastic. I call it fantastically improbable. Is a term I coined in the book to mean once you have an improbability that's beyond even the probabilistic resources of the entire universe for billions and billions of years.
Well, he hasn't established. I mean, so that's the other thing, right? Because you could also think that these processes happen on other planets, and maybe some planets life doesn't form, and in some it does. And we're on the planet where life did form. I don't know that you need to make that argument, but the point is that in order to do these calculations, you need to make assumptions. You need to make assumptions about how many combinations there are, how many of them were suitable for life, how many of them aren't, how rapidly they can be explored, whether they're being explored randomly or not randomly, how many cells that there would have been to do the exploring, how many planets there are with those cells on them, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of assumptions you have to make. You don't just get to leap from observing that something is difficult to then multiply out a bunch of small numbers to get a tiny, like 10 to the minus 70 or whatever it is, and then declare that it's astronomically impossible. That has relied on a whole bunch of assumptions, many of which he hasn't even mentioned here. So these probabilities always depend on assumptions, which, I mean, in cases like this are very difficult to test, but in general, they don't even try to test them, right? It's very similar when we see these sort of Bayesian probabilities for like the resurrection and eyewitnesses and things like that. They just make all sorts of assumptions about independence and the prior probabilities and whatever, which are not justified. And then you get these really tiny numbers. Well, like it's trivially easy to get these small numbers. The question is, how well can you justify the assumptions that you needed to get there? And he's barely tried to do any of those. The only one that he's justified is the idea that most configurations of the protein will not produce the functional folds are necessary. And we can agree with that, but these astronomical probabilities don't follow, because he's made a whole bunch of extra assumptions about how the configuration space is explored and how long it takes to, I mean, he hasn't even told us how long it takes to explore a configuration and how long that they had. He's just there said, oh, it's beyond the possibility of the universe doing this at all, even all of the planets and billions of years. But he hasn't given us any reason to think that. He's just asserted it. But it's important to understand the leap that he just made there, because I think that's very unlikely that much of the audience will have appreciated that. What he established in his work, I mean, again, apparently there's criticisms of the work. I haven't looked at that specific paper, but even just taking that at face value, he's established that a certain thing is improbable. And from that, he's then making a whole bunch of leaps to essentially argue that any evolution of protein in any amount of time in the physical universe using any process, like any naturalistic process, is astronomically unlikely. But all of those extra steps are not things that he established in his work or has really justified at all.
You might as well say it's the stuff of fantasy. So it's not just improbable or extremely improbable, it's fantastically improbable. Because most people don't have, you think of winning the California lottery as that's improbable. It is improbable, but these are mild improbabilities compared to what we're talking about.
It'd be like winning it, I don't even know how many thousands or millions, maybe billions of times, who knows, which at some point, actually you mentioned William Dembski earlier. In 2008, we wrote a book, Understanding Intelligent Design. We're updating it. And of course, he's a PhD mathematician and studied the universal probability bound, meaning given the amount of time and resources, size of the universe, we can actually say certain things are functionally impossible. Right. And you're saying just alone, this one protein itself is at that or far beyond it. So it's logical.
You can only say they're functionally impossible if you make a whole bunch of assumptions about the processes that are giving rise to these things. I don't know about Dembski's work, but as we see here, there's actually no attempt to argue. Doug here has made no attempt to argue that the processes that were operative on Earth, let alone other planets, because he mentioned the size of the universe, so it could be other planets as well, were not sufficient to explore the number of possibilities in order to find functional proteins. He's just sort of declared that that's the case. He hasn't actually argued for it at all. And any assumption that you make to get to that produce that calculation can be questioned. I mean, and many scientists would just say, well, yeah, I mean, if it is the case that the time and space available does not permit exploration of the space of all possible amino acid sequences in this sort of random, independent way, then that probably is just telling us that that's not how it happened. It happened in a different way. In other words, these creationist intelligent design proponents seem to think that their calculations show that the outcome was impossible, but all that they show is that the outcome is very unlikely to have occurred through the mechanisms that they postulate in performing these calculations. All that tells you is that these mechanisms are very unlikely to have been the processes that led to these outcomes. It doesn't tell you that no other process could have led to it. just this essentially naive multiplying of probabilities together, assuming independence, is almost certainly not how it happened. But okay, well, that's not how it happened. How did it happen? Nothing follows from that. All it means is, well, we probably need to look harder and think about what other processes might have been operative that reduce the search space.
Possible. But in terms of saying that's believable and a good explanation, it's beyond ridiculous. Is that a fair way to frame it?
That's for sure true. Now, I don't think it meets I don't think one protein meets the Dembski one, because his is like 10 to the 120 or something like that. You take the Planck time.
Yeah. I think he pushed it back to be like as conservative as possible.
If you take something that's biologically not insane, it would have to be under 10 to the 40th. Because if you're talking about evolution, evolution isn't happening in the sun right now, in the galaxy. So the vast majority of the matter that is in our visible universe is irrelevant. There aren't organisms evolving.
Yeah.
So if you limit it to how many, if you limit it to one planet and say how many
well, it's not clear that you should, but even so,
organisms have ever existed on planet Earth in the entire history of life, you end up with a number that's not larger than about 10 to the 40th. And those would be the maximum opportunities for mutations to come up with something new. So
no, because so he's looking at that from the point of view of how evolution works today, which is typically through the production of offspring, but that's almost certainly not how it worked in the development of early life, when there could have been many samplings of different conformations that, different orderings of amino acids or nucleic acids that a protocell iterated through until it happened upon ones that were stable and then performed some function, probably a very crude function at first. This is the problem here, because what we're actually, I said at the start that this is the question that he asked initially was about evolution, not abiogenesis. But we're basically talking about abiogenesis, because we're talking about how the first proteins evolved, or at least that seems to be what he's saying. I think he's a little unclear, because he focused on that specific protein. I don't know when that protein evolved, or like how old it was. But at any rate, we seem to more be talking about the origin of functional proteins of any kind, more generally. And so that pushes us back really outside the realm of what evolution can tell us, at least sort of Darwinian evolution, certainly. And we're really talking about like molecular evolution at that point, which is quite poorly understood. And especially at the very early stages, where we're talking about like protocells before even we have like sort of modern bacteria cells. And at that point, we're not restricted by the same rules, because we're not operating in a world in which life is widespread. It's a world in which life is just getting started. So the same mechanisms that operate now certainly weren't operative there. And so a cell doesn't have to, it doesn't like get one chance to mutate and then pass on its offspring. The protocells almost certainly explored a wide range of possible orderings of nucleic acids or amino acids, whichever came first. Then those were almost certainly not passed on through like genetic means, but just through duplication and then like fission of the protocells. I mean, there's different theories about exactly how this happened, but again, he's making very strong assumptions here in saying that, oh well, there's sort of like one chance per organism that ever existed to change the amino acid sequence of a protein, which is just not true. I mean, even today that's not true, because you can have mutations of different copies of the same of different copies of the gene, for example, if there's multiple copies in a cell. And if there's an organism that has multiple cells, then you can have mutations in different cells. But also there can be mutations at different time points. Like it's not like that a cell only exists for one time point. There's many opportunities for mutation. And then going back in time, before modern genetic machinery was operative, it's likely that there were even more opportunities, because the biological principles that are now operative weren't operative then, and things worked differently, and it was probably much more fluid. And I mean, that's the initial idea, that you have amino acids being created. They're sort of starting to form short chains and then longer chains. And many of those wouldn't have done anything, but some of them by chance would have been slightly more likely to replicate themselves. And so you start to get the first protocells forming. This is my understanding of the current theories. And it's just not the case that we have this like rigid idea of one organism means one chance for a mutation. And so if there are more combinations of possibilities than there are organisms that ever existed, therefore it's implausible that it ever happened. Like that's just not appropriate. What you need to establish is how many opportunities for different sequences could have been explored in the amount of time that was available. And he hasn't actually told us anything about this. He hasn't told us about how rapidly different possibilities can be explored. He's telling us about the number of organisms that existed, but that's not the same thing. It's not really even that relevant, or at least not directly.
Once you have a target that's smaller, significantly smaller than 1 in 10 to the fourth, you really got something that the sampling that has happened in the entire history of life could not have hit a target.
But that's, first of all, you don't know how the sampling works. That's the whole question. How did the sampling happen? And second of all, it's not like one sequence per organism. That's just obviously not true. Even today, that's not true. And that certainly wouldn't have been true in the protocells world, where many of the current principles of how these things work, of how like you have a DNA sequence, which then produces on the basis of that template, a specific protein sequence, and then that will be inherited with relatively little mutation in the next generation. Like that didn't exist in the protocells time. So there's much more opportunities, almost certainly many more opportunities for mutation and different combinations to be explored. And you only had this more sort of rigid process of pre-specified structure later on as those processes evolved. So it's just really unconvincing the way that he's sort of making this link between number of combinations and number of organisms that have existed. And it's sort of unfortunate, because I think that most laypersons that won't appreciate this at all, because it's sort of a subtle point. But the probabilities that he is giving are just completely meaningless without a theory of how the sampling takes place. And he hasn't offered one. The one that he's using is the crudest imaginable one. And so at best, you could just say, well, obviously it didn't use this very crude independent one at a time sampling method. And certainly not the idea that he seems to be promoting, which is like one organism that existed in evolutionary history with one opportunity to explore one specific sequence of amino acids, which is just obviously false. So all that these astronomical numbers that he's coming up show is that his model of how the sequence space is being sampled is not a good model. It doesn't tell you anything about whether it's actually impossible for the outcome to occur. It only tells you about the process that he's modeling here, and his process is implausible.
Okay, I want to remind people, if you're listening and you're skeptic or critic and you're like, I'm not convinced, here's a study online or here's a fact that disproves this, email me questions at seanmcdowell.org, write it in as a comment. We have Doug coming back live Tuesday at 4:30, and we will tackle some of these. Now, in a minute, I'm going to come back to some of the objections you've received in the academic world, and you've addressed a lot of these. But you mentioned this early on, what you call the universal design intuition.
Yeah.
So we started with saying the beginning of this protein materialistically is functionally impossible. It's fantastic.
So note, again, that's not what he's established. What he's established is that according to the assumptions that he's made about the mechanism by which that protein originated, it's very implausible that it developed in that way. We can accept that and simply conclude, well, it must have been one or more of your assumptions must have been false. In other words, the way in which these proteins evolved must have been different to the way that you assumed it was. Now, he might ask, well, tell me how they did evolve. And the answer will be, well, we don't know. Like, I'm sure that there are people more knowledgeable of this who could tell him some of the leading theories. But the most honest answer might be, we don't know, but that doesn't mean that there isn't any. I mean, if you took this attitude, we'd never make any advances in science, because any open scientific question is an instance in which we don't know the answer. And therefore, if you always just said, well, God must have done it, which he hasn't said yet, but I think he's about to get to, you would literally never do any science because it would always just be an instance of, oh, there's an unsolved scientific problem. We'll just plug God in that hole. So this is sort of ridiculous, unless there's a special reason to think that this problem is unsolvable in a way that, like every other scientific problem has been solved. His fundamental logic just makes no sense. It's literally, here's an unsolved scientific problem. So therefore it must be impossible to solve it using any materialistic or like physical process. That's just an absurd leap that flies in the face of like all scientific progress ever. So like, why would you think that? We need some reason to think that just because we don't know how it happened now, that there is no way that it could have happened using materialistic processes. But I think that this is where the conflation is made, right? That it kind of happened in this way, like this very sort of simplistic model that he presented before, and therefore it kind of happened in any way. But of course that just doesn't follow, right? The probabilities are only valid if the assumptions are correct, and the fact that the probabilities indicate that extreme unlikelihood of it happening that way just tells us that one or more of the assumptions are wrong. It doesn't tell us that any other combination of assumptions could not have could not make it. Like, it could not explain how the outcome occurred. He needs to, if he's going to claim that it does, he needs to give us a reason to think that no other possible explanation could could be devised. But he hasn't said anything about this. Well, maybe he will. So let's see. We've got 20 minutes left.
Well, that's critiquing materialism. Then we want to know, okay, is there positive evidence for design? Because the most common...
Yeah, this is a good point, by the way. So this guy has a PhD. He's done postdocs in molecular biology. He knows more than enough to know that his arguments make no sense, that you can't make this conclusion. Even if you accept all of his specific data that he cited, you can't draw this conclusion. All you can say scientifically is that we don't know. It's absurd to make this giant leap to some sort of intelligent design. And so, you know, it's hard not to see that there's some amount of dishonesty or motivated thinking going on here in making these sort of absurd leaps, which he should very well know is not appropriate given the claims that he's making. Even if you take all of the specifics at face value of like his particular studies of that particular protein.
Rebuttal is this is kind of God of the gaps.
Yeah.
You're saying, no, we can actually infer design from this, but your approach is a little different than Dembski's approach, Behe's approach. You lean into this universal design intuition. So tell us what it is and why you think we can trust that when it comes to your work.
Yeah, so I came across this when I was doing the initial work that was like putting together the ideas to become the book that became Undeniable. And something I came across, this may be the quote I've used more often other than scripture, is Alison Gopnik wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal. She is or was, at the time, I don't know if she still is, she was a UC Berkeley psychology professor. She may still be. And in this article, she wrote, by elementary school age, children start to invoke an ultimate godlike designer to explain the complexity of the world around them, even children brought up as atheists, end quote. And I took it from the article that she was an atheist. She was talking about the work of someone else, Deborah Kellerman, who had actually done these studies and shown mom and dad don't have to be talking about God. They could be atheists and raising up son and daughter as atheists. But these kids, by say age 4, when they see a butterfly in the back garden, they just automatically, they intuit that this had to have been made by a godlike designer. And that surprises mom and dad because they've never mentioned a godlike designer. So her point, Gopnik's point.
I don't know the specific research. I don't really trust his presentation of it. Even children, if they live in an English-speaking country, they've heard people talk about God. They've heard it mentioned in some context. I don't know of any parents who can hermetically seal their children off from any mention of God. So I'm not really sure how you would sort of control for that. But also, like, who cares? So we know quite a bit about theories that people tend to form, whether it's due to some combination of innate processes or in, cultural upbringing. But we know the sorts of theories that people tend to form about how things work in the world: folk biology, folk physics, folk psychology, and a lot of these understandings or viewpoints are just completely wrong, or at substantial odds with how we understand things scientifically. Like the classic one is the idea that an object needs some external force to keep it moving, whereas in fact we know that an object will always continue moving in the same direction and velocity unless a force acts upon it. But that intuition arises because of the ubiquity of air resistance, for example, or resistance of in water or whatever the substrate is. So it sort of seems to us like it needs to have something pushing on it, but in fact that's not the case. There's a whole range of other views like this. And so this idea that there is that we have, some people have called it hyperactive agency detection. That's not specifically in children, but this idea that we tend to invoke invoke agency even when that's not present. I mean, it's very easy to show this. There have been studies which have shapes, literally just like squares and triangles and circles, that move around in certain ways. And if they accelerate and move in certain patterns, people will very naturally infer an agentic explanation like, oh, the triangle is chasing the square, even though it's just shapes moving around on a screen. So, you know, you could argue that that tendency is some manifestation of a cognitive bias that God put into us, I suppose, although it's not really clear why he would do that. But you could also just say that that's a quirk of human psychology, that we have a tendency to detect agency even when it doesn't exist, just like we have a tendency to see patterns in the clouds or in toast when they're not really there. So the point is, even if this phenomenon is true, that children do tend to identify some sort of creator, with respect to where animals come from or whatever. I don't know if that's true in that specific case, but there are other evidences that support similar sorts of inferences and sort of folk beliefs. What follows from that? Well, nothing really. That's how humans tend to think. Does that mean that there really is a designer? I don't really. It's sort of not clear that we know that many of these beliefs are false, like the folk physics, for example. So that should, I think, at least cause us to pause in thinking, well, that they must be reliable in the case of like inferring design. But what's it going to say about this?
This is bad because we seem to have this sort of, by nature, we seem to get this way of understanding things that we then have to educate out of kids come middle school, high school. And so the whole article was proposing that we start preschool giving, 3-year-olds their lesson in Darwinism, which I thought, well, that's the way you're taking this.
Interesting.
My take on this is, well, what if they're right? what if the 4-year-old is right? Isn't it interesting? You go to Romans 1 here. Isn't it interesting that we just automatically see this? And you don't have to be in a Christian household. You don't have to be in a theistic household. You could be being raised by atheist parents and you see this. I thought there's something really startlingly beautiful about that. Now,
okay, so this is just an observation at this point, even if we take it at face value. What follows from that? Still waiting to get to the crux of the issue.
Did not make the argument that that any intuition is infallible. What I did was I started with that intuition because I said, isn't it interesting that we all have this? And then I asked the question, what do you think the kids are seeing because they don't say this when they see a piece of gravel or a puddle, but when they see a dragonfly hovering in the backyard, they just intuit this. And the way I put it in the book is, what are they zeroing in on? And I don't know for sure. It's hard to go back into the mind of a 4-year-old. It's hard to interrogate a 4-year-old about how they thought about things. But I came up with a rigorous argument. So my approach was, hey, we all see this. Some people are denying it. But can we find a way to show that what those 4-year-olds are intuiting is actually factually true? And it may not be the way they're intuiting it, but can we show that there's actually a way to demonstrate that those 4-year-olds are actually correct? And so I'm less committed to a claim that I've identified what's going on in the 4-year-old's head, because I don't know for sure.
Yeah.
But for sure, you can go and do rigorous assessment and say, I don't know how they're thinking about it, but they're definitely right. And it is interesting that you can come up with a very sort of intuitive way of looking at things. I think humans have a very developed intuition about what could be a coincidence and what's beyond coincidence. So there's certain things that if we stumble upon them, we're very, like I mentioned, alphabet soup. If you have to do a little bit of work and you find a 3-letter word in your alphabet soup, fine. But if you lift the lid on the pan of alphabet soup and it's telling you don't forget your car keys or something, then your wife like messed around with the alphabet soup. That's not a coincidence because there's a message in there. So and you don't have to do the math. You don't have to do a calculation. You just know this couldn't have happened by accident.
That makes sense. Now
Well, this is weird. It's certainly true that humans have a very highly adaptive. Well, let me rephrase that. Humans certainly have a very sophisticated mechanism for identifying meaningful patterns. The thing is that very often we're wrong. And this is a well-studied phenomenon called apophenia, the tendency to see meaningful connections between things that are unrelated or just coincidental. And there's a lot of psychological study of this. And it's a very interesting phenomenon, and it can be manifested in like perceptual context, like seeing faces in clouds, or it can be manifested in hearing voices, like electronic voice phenomena kind of thing, or like playing backwards speech and then hearing people saying things in the audio, or it can take place in identifying coincidences in like sequences of events which are unrelated. Conspiratorial thinking is sort of involves a lot of this sort of pattern recognition style of thinking, and just sort of noting that certain things that occur could be seen as coincidental, or like too good to be a coincidence kind of thing, and therefore spinning a big elaborate theory around that. The point is that it's well known that humans can often go wrong and are hyper vigilant and overactive sometimes in detecting these sort of patterns. It's ridiculous to say that because humans tend to do this, that therefore they must kind of be right whenever they do it. Like when we know that they're not, and very often people go wrong, and that's well documented. This is just such a silly argument. I don't know how someone can make this with a straight face. Like, because people have a highly tuned tendency to detect patterns, therefore, when some people detect a pattern or detect a cause that's not coincident, that they think is not coincidence, they just must be right. Like, we know that that's wrong because very often people detect patterns that are false, that they're not real patterns. So you have to assess, well, what's the context and how likely is it that they're right in this particular case? You can't just point to a general phenomenon that people identify patterns that are not coincidental, and therefore, in any instance where some people claim that there's a pattern that's not coincidental, that therefore they are right, it just makes no sense. You need to establish why they are right in this particular context, as opposed to all the cases when they're not correct, as well as all of the people who don't perceive design in nature because they see it as evolved, for example. But even putting that aside, those who do, I mean, does that mean that they're right? Like, you can't just declare it unless you've established that it's 100% reliable. which it isn't. So it's just ridiculous.
Take us aside, but you mentioned the comment earlier about, can Darwinism ground our reasoning faculties? And of course, that's because if our brains were cobbled together by this blind, purposeless process, they weren't designed to understand truth. They just resulted from survival, and we can survive with false beliefs. So here's a case where they're saying, let's root out these intuitions, but let's trust other intuitions. And I'll say, wait a minute, if you're rooting out this one because you believe in Darwinism, you got to root all of them out to be consistent. But of course, nobody actually takes it that far.
What are you talking about, Sean? First of all, what intuitions is he talking about? So here, Doug was talking about a specific tendency that people have to basically distinguish between patterns that are coincidental or not meaningful, and patterns that are meaningful and not a coincidence and that are due to design. And this is a known phenomenon that people very readily do this, and they do it in many different cases, and often sort of spontaneously. And sometimes we're correct, and sometimes we're not correct. And this is apophenia, right? The fact that we very readily do this in cases where we're not correct. So I guess you could call this an intuition, that humans can develop an intuition that a certain observation or pattern of observations is not a coincidence. Basically, there's something behind it. Excuse me. I guess what Sean was saying is that people who believe in evolution are going to say that these sort of intuitions about design in nature are false, and we should reject those intuitions. Maybe we have them, maybe not everyone does, but regardless, for those of us who do have them, we should reject those intuitions because we think that they're not reliable. So then Sean, on the basis of that, then says, well, if you reject one intuition or a set of intuitions about something in the world, he didn't really qualify this at all. If you reject some intuitions, you have to, as being unreliable, you have to reject all intuitions. But that's just not true. Like, it's just an obvious fallacy. Like, you can reject some intuitions, but not others, Sean. Like, is it that complicated? Some intuitions are correct or are reliable, and others aren't. And it depends on the case, right? And that requires, careful reasoning and thinking and research to work this out. I don't like, it's not that complicated. Why would anyone think that because some of human intuitions formed on the basis of like judgments that we tend to make, that some of those are unreliable, that they're unreliable in certain contexts, that therefore every single intuition that we ever form about anything should also be thrown out? That just doesn't make any sense. I mean, it sort of depends on how you define intuition, I suppose. But like, Sean hasn't given us a definition here, so I just fail to see how anyone can find that argument in any way convincing. Yeah, some judgments that humans tend to form are reliable, some aren't, and it depends on the case, right? I don't actually think that you can explain all of this using evolutionary processes. I think that there's sort of a tendency to try to over-explain things evolutionarily. A lot of it, I think, is actually cultural and not biologically determined, but some of it is. For example, we definitely know that humans evolved to be able to learn language at a very young age, and that learning it requires socialization and interaction, hearing other people speak the language. But we definitely evolved to have the capacity to do that, and other animals did not. So that's a biological predisposition there, that we're predisposed to interpret certain types of input as like meaningful language. And it's almost, that's certainly true for vision as well. We know quite a lot about vision, and primates have quite good vision. But whether that's true for like agency detection, well, that's sort of unclear, right? So it depends on the case. The idea that you have all or none of them is just ridiculous.
Sure.
Okay, so let me ask you this question. What's been the toughest criticism of your research? I anticipate we'll get some questions people will have to respond to, but Steelman, one of the toughest objections, maybe online, maybe you've seen in a journal, and what your response would be.
He still hasn't presented a position. We're 40 minutes in. What he's told us is, according to one way of modeling protein evolution, it's extremely implausible that protein sequences could have evolved through this mechanism. You get very implausible probabilities if you make these certain assumptions. And then he's also told us that a lot of people have intuitions that nature is designed, and so we should take that seriously, is kind of all he really said. He didn't draw any specific conclusions there. So we've got intuitions about design, and we've got one particular way of thinking about protein evolution is not very plausible. There's still no argument here. He hasn't told us that we should think that anything was designed, or like why specifically that is the alternative. It's all by implication, right? This is how apologists nearly always do this. They just leave it implied as to that we should accept this alternative explanation without actually defending. What I want him to do is say, here's what I think, here's what Doug thinks, and here's why you should agree with me. Not just say that there's this other candidate explanation, which I rejected, without establishing whether there are any alternatives and what we should do in the absence of any alternatives. Maybe we should just keep it as an open question. That doesn't mean that we should, even if we don't know, that doesn't mean we should accept his explanation. Why is design a better explanation? And likewise, what does our intuition of design have to do with the existence of a designer? Like, would a designer give us that intuition? Why would they do that? It's not obvious to me why a design would give us an intuition of a designer. There's many other things that they could have done if they wanted to communicate their existence than giving us this sort of vague intuition that things are designed, which we know often goes wrong. There's no argument here. It's just implication by pointing out a few different things. Oh, look, improbable calculations of protein sequences. Oh, look, people have intuitions of design. Where's the argument here? Where's the theory? Where's the explanation? There isn't any.
I can give you what have been kind of the recurring objections. None of which I consider to be tough, but I'm biased.
Fair enough.
How can you have objections to a theory when we don't even have a theory? What's his position? I can infer what it is because I know about, where he works and what he advocates for. He probably spells that out a bit more clearly in the book, I'm guessing. But he hasn't actually told us here. He hasn't told us you should believe that proteins were designed because X, Y, and Z. And so how can I object to it? Because he hasn't actually advocated for any theory. He hasn't said what his view is.
So I think you mentioned God of the Gaps. That's a very common. We could go into what people mean by that. But more specific to this work that was published in the Journal of Molecular Biology in 2004, it's a study on one enzyme. And I come to, and it was rigorously peer reviewed by people who do not share my view, went through peer review, top-notch editor of the journal, head of the European Bioinformatics Institute, was the editor who handled my manuscript, published in 2004. One of the recurring objections,
literally like the last paper that he published, hasn't followed up this work at all since then.
I get not at the level of JMB. So to be honest.
Yes, that is the last time he published any. There was one other, I think, methods paper in PLOS One in 2007. But the last publication that was actually on molecular biology on this sort of evolution issue is in 2004, Journal of Molecular Biology. Since then, he hasn't published. He's just published in his own Creationist journal and in Discovery Institute books, just defending creationism. He hasn't actually published any real science. Well, I reviewed this earlier in the video if you're interested.
Nobody has given a critique that has gone through peer review and is at the level of the paper itself.
Oh, wow.
I've had lots of people who critique in blogs and and say Axe is wrong because of this, but it's never been a high level critique.
But that could be because they don't think it's worth it. Do you know how long it freaking takes to get? I mean, I suppose you can publish like a note, which is not a whole paper, but it's like an observation. But yeah, publishing a proper paper it takes so long, and I don't know. Yeah, I don't know enough about the specifics of his work to really be able to say how impactful it was in the academy, as opposed to creationist space, to be able to say whether it was even like worth people's time. But this shouldn't really be relevant because the area that he's talking about is a very active area of research about molecular evolution and the origins of protein sequences and things like that. So there's plenty of people doing research in this area. So he could, even if they haven't directly responded to his article, he could talk about other theories because the vast, like almost no one else who published in this area agrees with him that it can be explained through intelligent design. So maybe he could just tell us about what the other theories are. It doesn't matter that they haven't specifically responded to his work, because the general point that like, well, yeah, there's lots of possible sequences and most of them won't be functional. So we need some method to explain how the possible sequences were sampled and then those that were functional were selected for. I mean, that's not really controversial at that, explained at that level. This is an open question as to how this happened. So regardless of whether it's in response to his specific paper, there's plenty of work on this. So what would be intellectually honest of him to do is talk about how other people answer this question or what they have to say about it, regardless of whether it was in response to his particular paper. The way they're presenting this here, I think that the layperson is going to get across as if this paper that he published somehow established that like molecular evolution was impossible, which it didn't. It was specific calculations about a specific phenomenon of a specific protein. That, yeah, like you mutate a bunch of the amino acids and you lose the functionality. that's fine. Maybe there was problems with the specific work, but you can accept that as someone who believes in evolution. It doesn't establish anything about molecular evolution being impossible. The claims that he's made, where he makes these claims about these astronomical low probabilities, is bringing in a whole bunch of extra assumptions, which he did not and has not established in his work. So the paper is just not that interesting, right? It's at best a small piece in a very large puzzle, but he's not telling us about the rest of the puzzle. He's focused on his piece and then building up this whole other account based on that, as if the small piece that he's contributed really answers a fundamental question, which it does not. So there's no real engagement here with the actual literature, especially what's happened in the last 20 years, working on like this molecular evolution. Maybe he's going to tell us in the last 10 minutes, but I'm not holding my breath. Like, he's focused on whether they've responded to his paper. Who cares about your paper? Tell us about what other scientists in this field think.
But a common recurring theme at the lower level is, well, that you just looked at one protein, and why would we believe that the numbers you came up with one protein would apply to all proteins? Another recurring thing is, actually, what I think happened is one guy named Art Hunt gave a critique of this on a blog called Panda's Thumb the year that or several months after the paper came out.
That blog. Don't know if it's
For the most part, everyone has just gone back to that original. I answered his full critique, and you'll still find if people want to critique
what was your answer
before, they dig around on the web.
This is so hypocritical. He's saying, oh, everyone just cites this one critique of my paper. They all go back to the same one, and it's from like 20 years ago. Do you see the problem here? Do you see the problem here, chat? He hasn't published anything else that's actually peer-reviewed since this paper. He's basing everything on this one paper. Well, plus that like silly design intuition thing. But like in terms of the molecular biology aspect, he's basing it all on this one paper and coming back to it. And now he's criticizing other people for just going back to this one blog post that responded to his paper. If it's okay for him to base everything on one paper that was published 20 years ago, why isn't it okay for everyone to appeal to a critique of that was written like 20 years ago? It's so hypocritical. It's unbelievable, the lack of self-awareness.
It goes back to Art Hunt, who had some misconceptions about the paper. He's a plant biologist. He actually contacted me and said, here's what I'm going to put on Panda's Thumb. Can you vet this for me? And I said, I corrected him. I said, you haven't actually understood parts of the paper right. Be that as it may, Hunt's critique is what people keep going back to.
You're going to tell us what his critique was?
Another critique has been...
He's not going to tell us. We'll take his word for it that the critique was wrong. But again, this is all a red herring. Look, I'm happy to grant the claims that he apparently made in the paper. I have not read the paper. I don't really care that much, because I'm happy to grant that that the function of many proteins is fairly specific to the amino acid sequence. I don't actually think that's a very controversial claim. Exactly how specific, of course, well, that's another question, and that's probably differs from different proteins. But yeah, like the order of the amino acids does matter, and you can't just scramble it dramatically and expect it to have a similar function. Now, I don't know which of the calculations that he just mentioned before, like the 10 to the minus 70 stuff. I don't know if he presents all of those in the paper. And so it could be an issue of which specific claims are being critiqued. It would surprise me if those survived peer review, because that's wildly speculative and does not seem to be at all supported by what he actually did, which was mutating a specific protein and seeing which of the results were functional. That seems fine. Wildly extrapolating on this very simplistic calculation of how many possibilities there were, and then claiming that therefore no molecular evolution could have evolved these proteins in even in very large sweeps of time. That's well beyond anything that he did. So I'd be surprised if that was actually in the paper. But anyway, like this is so frustrating because it's so intellectually dishonest. He's framing it as if he published this paper which demolishes molecular evolution, which is not really the same as Darwinian evolution. That's already one problem. And then no one's really rebutted it since. Whereas the fact of the matter is that this paper doesn't really establish that much that's relevant. It's a small piece. And so even if you would take this paper, or at least most of the claims of this paper, it just doesn't really matter that much. And he's pretending as if the inability to respond to his paper or like refute his paper in somehow implies that Darwinian evolution is in trouble, whereas the paper doesn't even talk about Darwinian evolution. It's like molecular evolution. Darwinian evolution starts from the existence of a cell that has a rich set of proteins already. How is it that this finding, even if we did think it was inexplicable how the proteins evolved, that doesn't undermine all of the other evidence we have for evolution, like the molecular evidence of the patterns of relatedness in different branches of life, or the fossil record, or the biogeographic evidence of the distribution of different animals. I'm sure he has all of the stock answers to these, which are all very implausible, but he hasn't told us here. He's pretending as if this one paper somehow refutes all of that. And it just doesn't, like, just very clearly does not. It's so intellectually dishonest, especially because instead of, see, what would have been interesting if he'd followed up this research program over the last 20 years and investigated a wider range of proteins, explored different hypotheses for how the sampling space of different configurations of amino acids, how that could have been sampled over evolutionary time, done more realistic and more varied, made like simulations of how that could have occurred. As far as I can tell, unless he's hiding it all in non-peer-reviewed journals or something, he hasn't done any of this in the last 20 years. It's all based on this one paper that he published 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago now. So that combined with the huge overclaim that he's making, over statements that he's making here, really just highlights to me that there's a lack of intellectual honesty here. A genuine scientist doesn't, I mean, genuine scientists do overclaim sometimes, but this is a very, very substantial overclaim. And particularly, they at least usually keep like pursuing their research agenda, whereas this guy hasn't. He's gone off and done other things. Now he's just a creationist shill. He doesn't actually do this work anymore, or at least he doesn't publish it. Anyway, so it's all very frustrating just how dishonest this all seems
that he made was Axe actually looked at he actually introduced mutations into this enzyme to make it a weaker enzyme before he did the study at the library.
So he tainted it in one sense.
Yeah. Now, this is all carefully described in the paper, and the peer review said, yeah, you did that the right way. The reason I did that is I did not want to come up with a probability for getting a highly perfected version of this enzyme. That would be far worse than 1 in 10 to the 77th. That might be 1 in 10 to the 105th. It'd be far worse. I perceived that if I were...
So maybe he did put that number in the paper. I have to check that, but like, it doesn't really matter, because even if the analysis he did was like the research that he did on that specific protein may have been fine, but that it doesn't follow that probability is correct. That probability is based on a whole bunch of assumptions, and the correct interpretation of that is just that, well, one or more of the assumptions are wrong. That doesn't prove that molecular evolution didn't happen. I mean, this is a very common thing in science. You compare different hypotheses, see how likely the data is given that hypothesis. If you get very unlikely results, it just means that that hypothesis is disfavored. It doesn't mean that like none of the, like there could have been no mechanism by which it occurred.
We're measuring the information content in a highly optimal enzyme, and I came up with a number, then the critique would have been, you're just looking at a highly optimal one. Evolution can work on a much lower one. So I anticipated that, and I said, I'm going to make it a wounded, functional, but not at all optimized version of this enzyme. And then I'm going to measure how hard it is to get this low level. So the Art Hunt critique is actually not understanding that I bent over backwards
to make it harder,
to make my number lower, to make the probability less scary by looking at what evolution would need is something that's good enough that you can optimize it. Because mutation selection is a reasonably good local optimizer. If it works, and you can do a few mutations to get it to work better, then you'll get that optimized. We've shown this with beta-lactamase in the lab. But you need that starting point. And that starting point has to be an actual folded enzyme that's functioning as an enzyme with an active site. And that's exactly what I started with. And that's how I got the 1 in 10 to the 77.
That's pretty remarkable. Over 2 decades later, there's no peer-reviewed, published, sufficient defeaters of your work. Right. I think that's
really not remarkable. It just means that it wasn't very impactful. I really got to look up this paper now. I did not expect that he would focus so much on this one paper. And we still haven't got an actual argument that what he believes, that there's no alternate theory. Okay, I've got to look this up now, partly just because I want to see how many citations it's had. Although I guess this might include citations by, okay, 240 citations. That's a reasonable number, although it's not an astronomical number. But also, I don't know how many of these are by creationists, which is a problem. Hopefully, those wouldn't be indexed on Google Scholar, so maybe not so many. But well, I can see at least one by actually Meyer here. So yeah, the number of citations might not be the best way of assessing this. Oh, how much of protein sequence space has been explored by life on Earth? This is interesting. That's not his paper. That's I want to see if this number, the 10 to the minus 70, is actually in the paper. All right, I would have checked this beforehand if I'd realized that like everything would depend on this one paper. It's also very odd that his supervisor is not listed as a co-author on this paper, which is odd if you're a postdoc. It's just he's the sole author. That is quite unusual. Can't I access it? Nope, it's behind a paywall apparently. Oh, I don't have that logged in. Bugger. So I want to see if this calculation is actually present in the paper, because that seems pretty wild to me that you would just like throw in something like that. But I've got to look it up on my other browser. Okay. It'd be really interesting to know how many of these citations were like in non-creationist stuff, as opposed to like actual scientific publications. Oh, come on. Jeez, why is it so difficult to... Oh, just trying to get a PDF of the thing. All right, finally, got it. I guess I might as well share. Hang on. Got too many things open here. Yeah, let's have a look-see at this paper. I won't have time to read the whole thing, but I'm mostly interested in whether these calculations appear in it, because the experimental work sounded fine to me in general. It's the inferences that he makes on it that I have the issue with. And I won't be surprised if that got through peer review, but it depends on exactly what he says. Okay, here it is. In all its glory. 2004, single author, weird as a postdoc. Yeah, okay, it's even in the abstract here. Okay, that's interesting. The estimated prevalence of plausible hydrophobic patterns of any fold and recent folds for particular proteins. This implies the overall prevalence of sequences performing a specific function by any domain size fold may be... that's very sneaky. So that's not... Oh, geez. I'll sequence identity matrix. That is not what he just said in the video. Yeah, so this all seems fine. He's doing mutations. He's seeing what effect they have. Ooh, this is interesting. Alternative models of how function might map onto sequence space. Well, this is sort of what I was saying here. So we don't actually know what the relationship is between different sequences and how functional they might be. I mean, it could be very noisy. Even there may be multiple peaks here. And that makes the probabilities highly, like very difficult to compute. Because he can only sample a very small proportion of this sequence space here. But anyway, I want to see what he says about these probabilities. Where does that 10 to the minus 77 come in? Here it is. Based on the estimated proportion of set L that is within set F. So this would be, yeah, the subsets of the sequence space. Wait, I lost where I was. Sub 10, something in the range of 10 to the 64. What proportion of all sequences fall within set H? Yeah, so he's doing what I was saying before, exploring sequence space. So he gets this number here, something like 10 to the 74 form folded, 1 in 10 to the 74 to 10 to the 50 form folded structures. Okay, that's interesting. I don't know how good these numbers are. I mean, he's appealing to them from other papers, so I don't know how reliable that is. But okay, so what he's saying here is the proportion of all sequences of large domain length that perform the specified function by means of any tertiary fold is estimated to be in the range of 1 in 10 to the 77 to 1 in 10 to the 53. Interesting that he cites the highest end of that rather than the lower end, but I mean, they're both still very high. At first glance, it seems plausible that natural sequences could diverge through a space where the function is represented so sparsely. But the answer follows from the fact that functional sequences are not distributed uniformly, which is what I was saying, right? They're not randomly distributed. A randomly changed to a functional sequence actually has a good chance of leaving function undisturbed if very few positions are affected. As estimated above, the likelihood of a signature compliant substitution in the large domain reference is about 38%, since 70% of the 1,000 possible non-synonymous base sequences, blah, blah, blah. About 1 in 4 random single residue changes are functionally neutral. Yeah, well, the thing is, if the relationship between sequence and function is not simple, then there may be vast spaces within like vast subsets of the sequence space that give rise to comparably good function that you just don't know about, and can't sample using the method that he did. I don't know how many mutations he made at any one time. I'd have to read through more carefully, but I'm most interested in what he's doing with this number here. The proportion will be somewhat lower under conditions requiring a higher level of function, but not so low as to be progressive sequence divergence by gradual accumulation point mutations. However, it's not obvious default diversity is as easily explained as sequence diversity. Yeah, a commonly accepted view is new folds are pieced together from small parts of existing folds. That's kind of what I was saying before. I was saying that you don't just get this. Oh, I don't want you to. Have I been showing my email the whole time? Or did I just flip to that? I don't want you to see. No, I just flipped to that. Yeah, so you don't just form a protein by exploring a random sequence of adding each amino acid like one at a time randomly. You accumulate small domains which do something useful, and then you put those together to form the larger structure. That is, that's my understanding of what the leading model is, or at least in general terms. And that is what he's saying here. A commonly accepted view is that new folds are pieced together from small parts of existing folds. So it's not like one at a time amino acids. It's you form smaller pieces and then you put those pieces together. So that would mean that the calculation that he's derived is not relevant because you're not just doing it one amino acid at a time. To the extent that a new fold is really new, its formation must require the joint solution of at least a considerable number of new local stabilization problems. Yeah, so there'll be multiple constraints that have to be satisfied, but I mean, he's not quantifying that. How likely is it that sequences that carry the hydropathy signatures of the folds and not strong signatures may be pieced together in such a way as to satisfy? Gee, that's a really long sentence. The analysis provided here, bearing in the mind the uncertainties, calls for careful examination of such piecing scenarios. Well, yes, this is just the question. How do you put together the different pieces to form a fully functional protein? It can't be done just by randomly doing it in an independent way, like one at a time, which is what, as far as I understand, these calculations assume. That's obviously not a plausible scenario, and that's what he said here. It's put together piecewise from smaller parts. And he's also said that there are many types of mutations which don't actually change the function. So if recreating a fold by ordered assembly of sections of sequences that already adopt that fold is not a simple manner, generating new folds from parts of old ones may be less feasible than has been supposed. Okay, so this is sort of what I suspected. So he does mention this number here. Interestingly, it's a range between 10 to the 77 and 10 to the 53, and he states the higher one. What he says is simply that this is the proportion of a oh, that's a pretty useless figure caption, but it's the proportion of, as I understand it, the sequence space that would give rise to the relevant function when he makes certain assumptions about. Well, yeah, no, that's just, yeah, the proportion of sequence space that would give rise to the relevant function. Although I don't think that he can definitively say that because he doesn't actually know what most of sequence space looks like. He has to make assumptions like about the relationship between sequence space and function. And so he's pulled some numbers in here, which almost certainly could be questioned. But the point is, even if you say that it's only a small proportion of sequence space that gives rise to the relevant function, that doesn't mean that it's implausible that that could have evolved. And that's what he says here. How then did natural sequences, he says diverge here. I'm not showing why he's saying diverge instead of develop. Maybe he's talking about divergence over time, like in different species. But, hang on, what's 5? Yeah, I think he's, yeah, I think he's talking about divergence of protein sequences and like different organisms as they evolve over time. Well, I guess he doesn't think they evolved over time. So, but anyway, I mean, in this paper, that's what he's talking about. So he's not actually assessing the question of how it evolved in the first place. The closest he comes is talking about here. The point is, though, that even if there's only a tiny realm of the sequence space which gives rise to the desired function, it's not the case that all of that space must have been traversed like one combination at a time in order to have found that solution. That's only true if you assume that evolution didn't use any more sophisticated search scenario. And that's precisely what he's talking about here. You piece together a fold from small parts of existing folds. And so you don't have to explore the whole space. You take essentially a shortcut through it. I mean, this is an analogy here would be if you want to sort a list of numbers, you don't just shuffle the list, see if it's sort it and then shuffle it, if not shuffle it again, that would require you to go through, in expectation, half of all of the possible orderings in order to find the shuffled one. That is incredibly inefficient. We have much more efficient sorting algorithms that can do it in much, much, much less time. So the idea is evolution just needs some mechanism for finding the functionally relevant sequence combinations in order to arrive at the one that's functionally that performs a relevant function. And I suspect there's probably other functional combinations within the sequence space that he hasn't identified here because this space is so large. But even so, really the core issue is there a mechanism that evolution can use to search the space more efficiently? And he is saying in this paper that the commonly held view is that there is. That's what he says here. And he sort of alludes to the fact that, well, maybe it's more difficult than people have thought. But he doesn't say that the probability that it could have evolved is 1 in 10 to the minus 77. That's why I was laughing when I saw it in the introduction here, or sorry, in the abstract here, because he says the overall prevalence of sequences that perform the function is as low as 1 in 10 to the 77. That's not the same as the probability that could have evolved, or like the number of combinations that would have had to have been searched. You only have to search that number of combinations if you're using the most inefficient search strategies. So this is where the dishonesty comes in, right? I knew that this would be the case. So that probability is in the, he never actually states it as a probability, but that number is in the paper, but he's interpreting it totally differently in the interview, and presumably in his other work as well. I don't know of all the specifics, but what I did look at this paper seems fine to me. There may have been other issues there, but the way he's interpreting it is completely wrong. He's misinterpreting his own work here. What his own work established is just what I said at the outset, that for this particular protein, and in the way he assessed it, the range of sequence, the proportion of sequences that give rise to the relevant function is very, very tiny. That's the 10 to the 77 here, 10 to the minus 77 with the proportion. Although he said it was a range between 10 to the 77 and 10 to the 53, so he's sort of picking the lower end there. But anyway, it does not follow that you have to actually sample all that number of combinations in order to find the right one. And that's where the comparison to, like, remember he said 10 to the 40 different organisms that have ever existed, even though that's also irrelevant because it's not like it's one chance per organism, but you don't have to sample all of those possibilities in order to get to the outcome. You need a more efficient sampling method. In this paper, he says himself that the currently understood method is that evolution has more effective sampling methods by putting together small segments that do something useful and then combining those together, which dramatically reduces the space that has to be sampled. He says, well, you know, there's difficulties there, so maybe it's harder than people thought. Well, maybe, but that doesn't mean that you can say that the fact that there's this 10 to the 77 number of possibilities, that therefore you have to sample like all of those or like half of those on average to find it, it is correct. That's not correct. And you can't therefore claim that this somehow establishes that molecular evolution of the origin of proteins is impossible. He's misstating what his own paper shows. And the fact that he hasn't followed up on this at all with any further work in the last 20 years is just, I think, further evidence of this. He's not actually interested in this question. He's just using it as a prop that helps support his narrative, which is sort of ironic because he hasn't even told us what the narrative is. But, you know, by implication, we infer that the narrative is that you can't explain how these proteins developed. Oh, looking at the paper just pisses me off more. It's so dishonest what he is doing. Classic Mott and Bailey nonsense. Exactly, right? When critiqued, he'll retreat to this quite modest claim about the number of different possible sequences that can give rise to a certain function, which seems fine to me. But then what he actually wants to claim is that this somehow proves that molecular evolution is impossible, which then somehow disproves Darwinian evolution, which it does not, which then somehow establishes intelligent design, which it also does not, because you could reject Darwinian evolution, but that doesn't establish design. So every stage of this is completely unjustified. And it's really, really frustrating to see science abused this way. And that's why we say creationism, intelligent design is pseudoscience, because it takes some valid scientific findings like this paper here, which there may be specific issues, but at least in terms of that conclusion, that didn't seem objectionable to me. It takes that and then twists it and abuses it in order to defend a specific pre-established belief system. And that is exactly the opposite of the approach that we should take in science, which is being skeptical and open-minded and critical of our own work. The fact that no one has published a peer-reviewed refutation of this paper doesn't tell us anything, because the paper itself at least seems to be not particularly objectionable. So that's not the problem. And you notice how Weasley he was when asked about this. What are the main objections? He talked about objections to the paper. I don't care about objections to the paper. What I care about is objections to your theory of intelligent design. That's what people like me are worried about, not this specific paper so much. There may be problems with it, but those are tiny compared to the issue that we have with you saying that it supports intelligent design, which it absolutely does not. Yeah, well, I mean, you can imagine, because he deliberately conducted this work in order to prove intelligent design. He basically said that. And as it is, and I said this at the outset before I even really looked into this paper, you may recall, I don't know how you could possibly try to answer this question about evolution just by testing, just by analyzing the sequence of one specific protein. There's no way that you can do that, regardless of what results he found. But even there, the results that he did find, whilst in some way supportive of his initial hypothesis, like that there's a very small space of sequence space that gives rise to certain functions, I felt like that was kind of already known. I guess he did say that some people thought that it might be broader because maybe it only depends on whether it's hydrophobic or not. The amino acid is hydrophobic. So maybe it was smaller than some people had thought. Okay, fine. That's an interesting scientific finding. But that goes essentially nowhere at all to establishing intelligent design or disproving evolution. So he spent years doing that, and it didn't really establish what he wanted to or get him really close. And he essentially got kicked out of the academy. The fact that his supervisor there was not a co-author on that, I think, is telling, because that would be quite unusual to work as a postdoc and then not be co-author on your papers. So I don't think that's accidental. But he already told us about the manner in which he left. So, but anyway, so all he has is this paper. And he's done nothing since then, effectively, no real scientific work. So 20 years of just pretending that this paper establishes really anything of interest about evolution. Very, very upsetting. And it's particularly upsetting that Sean McDowell is showcasing this stuff. This is one of the reasons I wanted to look at this video, is because, I mean, he's probably done more in the past, but Sean McDowell isn't a creationist channel in the sense that he focuses on that. I'm less interested in covering the Discovery Institute, but these sort of more mainstream apologetics channels usually don't cover as much creationist stuff, and some of them especially are critical of creationism. So the fact that Sean McDowell is platforming this, I thought was of interest and worthy of review. So we've only got about 10 minutes left, and I just want to hear if he actually either tells us what his theory is, because he still hasn't. He hasn't defended any theory about what we should believe, or tells us anything about what current scientific views are about molecular evolution or the origin of proteins, which are the two most important things, neither of which he said anything about so far.
It's really, that's significant. I love to hear that. And I want to remind people listening, we're in part of a 3-part series on the evidence for design, the origin of the universe. And then we have fine tuning. And we've got Steve Meyer, we've got Jay Richards as a part of this. And one of the reasons I believe in God is you start to add these probabilities together, not just the origin of life, but fine tuning, a universe from nothing. And even some arguments we're not looking at, the argument is really compelling when taken as a whole. And again, you're in the...
Well, if you combine together a bunch of crap arguments, you just get a really crap argument. It doesn't get better. I don't think that Sean McDowell really understands much of anything about what's been said here. He just knows, really small probability under naturalism. Well, that proves naturalism is false, right? Just an embarrassment.
Movie, The Story of Everything, that's being released theatrically soon. A couple questions for you, maybe a couple quick ones. Is AI in any way making this easier or harder for people who are trying to explain the origin of the protein? Do we have better tools to figure out how it could happen materially? Or is it making people go, oh my goodness, even with AI, we can't explain this?
There's different ways you could go about this. So I haven't read this paper, but I've heard, and will read it, of a project where they used AI to try to design a new protein. And I'm going to go do the reading. So I won't give a...
Why did Sean ask this? What does this have to do with anything? Is it just... It's just because AI is hot right now and he thought that he'd throw that in. I mean, who cares if AI is helping to answer these questions or not? What matters is, what do non-creationist scientists have to say about molecular evolution, the origin of proteins? How do they think it happened? What's the best alternative explanation? And then what's your theory, Doug? How do you think it happened? And what's the evidence for that? That's the only thing that matters. What are the facts? What are the competing explanations of the facts? How do we assess their probability? Note that we've done none of that. We haven't established what the facts are to be explained. The only facts we've talked about are the ones mentioned in his one specific paper. But as I said, he hasn't mentioned anything about fossil evidence, anything about all of the mountain of other molecular evidence, the biogeographic evidence. So we don't have a cohesive view of what the facts are that need to be explained. We don't have his theory. What's his theory about how it came to be? I'm guessing it involves a designer, right? But he hasn't actually told us, because just appealing to a design doesn't actually tell you, well, why did they design this? Like, why would God make an intricately designed protein? Why does he need that? What's the point of that? Of all of the things that he could do, why would he do that? And then you have a similar probability of, like, of all the things that could happen, why this one? This is an issue I've raised before, and I think applies to almost any theistic explanation, that God is so unbounded that the probability that he does any one particular thing is extremely low. So it offers a very poor explanation for it. So you need to give us some meat on this explanation as to why it is that the outcome is actually expected given theism, because that's entirely unclear. And then we also need to know then what the rival explanation is, or what do current molecular biologists and evolutionary biologists have to say about the origin of proteins, protocells and molecular evolution and so forth. So he's given none of the three ingredients we need: the data, his theory, and the alternative theory, in order to actually assess this. It's all cherry picking of just like essentially the one study that he did on this, and then absurd extrapolations and misinterpretations of what that study actually shows, and then just vague implications about, oh, people have a design intuition, so like that's probably reliable, right? And then Sean McDowell makes this ridiculous point that if you reject one intuition, you must reject all intuitions that we ever have, like, which is just so stupid. And so far, he hasn't mentioned anything about what other scientists think about this, even though he mentions it in his paper 20 years ago. So there's been 20 years of research since then. It's so dishonest. It's unbelievable. Well, it's not unbelievable. You know what I mean. And now, given the almost complete absence of substance in this nearly 50 minutes so far, Sean McDowell is asking this stupid question about AI, which just has nothing to do with anything. I mean, yeah, you know, there's the AlphaFold and other stuff. People have used some tools here, but just warding off comments. But the point is, it's not really centrally relevant to anything. It's just one technique that you might use to help answer here. So why are we talking about that?
That's right. It's irrelevant. But from what I can see, what they got, so what they do is you train an AI on, here's what protein structures look like, here's what they do, here's their amino acid sequence. If you give them 1 million of these, which you can now, you can imagine that you could train an AI to spit out sequences that might structurally look like this. Now, when I look at that, I'm thinking, I don't believe it's actually going to be able to give you new protein structures. And I don't believe that's happened here, but there's a paper where they tried that. It appears to me I think they didn't even get structures, but they looked at a catalytic function, and they got catalytic function to go up somewhat, but they acknowledge in the paper that it's nowhere near the catalytic function that you get in actual enzymes. I've published papers where I've shown you don't have to have a folded protein to do some simple catalysis. And you can have simple, like lemon juice can destroy penicillin. Vinegar can destroy penicillin. It's through a simple acid-base catalysis. You can hydrolyze penicillin. Well, a beta-lactamase does that much, like many orders of magnitude more efficiently by having an enzyme. And that's a key distinction. So I think this AI approach, I think I'll reserve judgment for sure. Until
maybe by Tuesday, I'll give you homework for the live Q&A.
I'll be able to say more about it. From what I can tell,
this just has nothing to do with anything.
They didn't actually nail it. And that would help to show that even when you throw millions of structures at something and train it, it's not a slam dunk that you can reconfigure a protein. But even if you could.
What does reconfiguring have to do with anything? That's like protein synthesis isn't, like artificial protein synthesis or protein design is not the question that we're addressing here. The question is the evolutionary origin of proteins and the protein sequence. It's not how can we change them now. Those questions may be related, but not necessarily, because the environment in which life evolved is very different to the environments we have today and the environments we can necessarily engineer in the lab.
That's not giving any credence to the idea that natural processes just stumble upon
probably something like that.
Clearly, ChatGPT is putting out, if I ask it a question, it's putting out sequences of letters and words that are extremely improbable in the space of all probabilities, but it's been trained to put out ones that are highly improbable, but they conform to the patterns that human writing do. To some extent, it has its flaws for sure. But there's another interesting angle on AI, and here I think materialism does get a boost from AI, and it's the illusion, I think it's an illusory boost, the illusion that a machine can think. The illusion, if we go back to physical,
this is going to piss me off too much, because this is my area.
Illusion.
I'm just going to skip this.
Ideas,
is he saying anything about evolution?
You have to put into that system.
For sure.
I agree with that. That's a fascinating question. Of course, I would point out what Stephen Meyer often points out, that if you have systems of AI spitting out these proteins,
we're still talking about
to explain even a simple protein, we have design intuition that points towards this being designed.
Okay, here we go. I think he's actually putting this together,
so to speak, and doesn't quite simulate what needs to be explained. All right, so we're going to wrap up here. Obviously, at the beginning, we asked the question about the big question. What's at stake with this? You've argued that materialism is not even close to explaining even a simple protein. We have design intuition that points towards this being designed. In your mind, what follows for the big question from this argument alone?
If we go back to what or to whom do we owe our existence? From this,
it only took them 51 minutes to get here, guys, to actually the point as to the scientist says Darwinism can't explain life, which they haven't addressed yet at all. They've just said that one particular model can't explain the origin of proteins, which isn't really anything to do with Darwinism.
Fine argument. I think you can, it's a robust argument with lots and lots of layers. I've contributed a small piece to it, but if you look at everything that's been done, it's huge. We have a staggering case.
So we acknowledge that his paper is a small piece. Fair enough. So why do we focus so much on it? You need to explain how it's relevant in the context of other considerations in order to make the point. I mean, they had nearly an hour. They could have done better than this.
Made against the idea that we are alone in a impersonal cosmos, that maybe some, quantum foam universe generator belched out our universe, and it happened to have the right properties that life could survive in, and planet Earth is a rare planet, but it happened to have properties that allow life to exist, and something caused a first cell, and all of that by accident evolved into us. This can now be
I guess that's his rival explanation, even though I don't know that really anyone says those things, or at least, well, I suppose some people might, but that's not a scientific explanation. That's just a bunch of buzzwords that he's put together, like quantum foam and things. More interesting would be, what is the alternative best scientific explanation for, say, the origin of proteins and how protein sequences evolved and were initially selected? And how does that compare with the rival explanation, which we still don't have? We still have just vague references to design, which honestly just seems to be enough for these people. They never actually have, or I should say almost never have, actual worked out hypotheses or theories to explain anything. It's just a vague reference to design or a miracle or something similar. It's unbelievably pathetic. Because of course, all of the atheist has to do is say, "Oh, well, some unknown natural process did it." I mean, and that's as, I think that's more honest, but it has as much substance as just saying, "Oh, a designer did it." So why should we accept a designer as opposed to an unknown natural process? This is always a sort of relevant question there. But I think that we can do better than an unknown natural process, because we do have some ideas about how it could have happened, although still a lot of unknowns. And Doug mentioned them in his own paper. He says, yes, we find the full fold of the protein by putting together components of smaller folds. And he says, well, there's still some, questions about it. Maybe it's not as likely as people thought, but his calculation doesn't actually apply to that, right? Like his calculation doesn't tell us how likely or unlikely that is. His calculation is just about the space of possible sequences and how many of them give rise to the relevant function. It doesn't say anything directly about how those are sampled. So, Doug, you need to tell us about why it's so unlikely that there could be a natural mechanism to more efficiently sample those, especially when you have told us in your paper that most people think that there are such processes and you don't actually refute them. All you say is that, well, maybe there's some other issues. Your probabilities don't actually apply to that. It's so dishonest. He knows this because it's in his paper. And he worked in this field for like 20 years or something, nearly 20 years, I think, from when he started his PhD to when he left. So he must know this, and yet, conveniently, he just never talks about it.
Robustly, rigorously rejected. And that means we're not cosmic accidents. And I think if you just go the step of saying intelligent design, okay, some intelligence has to be responsible for us being here, that takes you a big step toward the truth. But I think you also see in what kind of beings are we? Well, we're persons. So now I think it's not just some like AI type intelligence, pseudo intelligence. There has to be a personal intelligence behind.
Wow. Amazing inference here. We are persons. So what made us must also be a person. Just, claps all around. Like, what a stupid argument. Like, humans make toasters. The fact that a toaster is designed doesn't mean that it came from another toaster. I mean, I know that's kind of a silly example, but so is the inference that he just made. Why do we have to come from another person just because we are people? Like, there's just, there's absolutely nothing there. It's just pure assertion.
That's because we embody personhood, and something that doesn't have any conception of personhood would not be able to make us. So
how do you know that? How does he know? Even put aside naturalism for the moment, how does he know that of all possible things that could have explained us, any type of intelligence, it has to be a personal intelligence? Because there are absolutely other conceptions like Tao in Taoism. It's not really a creator. It's more like a sort of a cosmic force. Or there's Brahman in Hinduism, which is hard to describe. It's like less personal, certainly, than the personal God in Christianity is typically understood. Or you could have something like the Force from Star Wars, or I don't know, make up something, some sort of magical or paranormal idea that tickles your fancy. Come up with anything that you like. any of those things could hypothetically explain the design in the universe. It doesn't have to be another person. Just because, I mean, it's clear that the conclusion was there at the outset, because you can't get to where his endpoint there from the steps that he made. That there's just chasms of empty space in his reasoning. And it's always interesting to me. I mean, William Lane Craig does this as well. It's just like every other possibility is just waved away with a few words or sentences at most, and we just somehow leap to, oh, and it's the theistic God, because of course it is, because as if there was any doubt as to where we would end up. They don't even try to show a reasoning process as to how they get there. So embarrassing.
It takes you in that kind of reasoning very close to the God that we know to be true, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a personal creator God who had us in mind, created us in his image, and not just for entertainment, but there's a purpose for this. There's a reason that we're here.
And where did that come from? How do you know that there's a purpose? Like, even each step is just disconnected from the last one. Okay, let's grant that they had to be designed, and let's grant that it had to be a personal designer. Not that he defended any of those things. How does it follow that there was a purpose for our creation? Maybe he just did it for his entertainment. It's just idle amusement. Like, how do you know that there has to be a purpose? That's yet another assumption that's been added on. And of course, we know that because he told us at the outset why he thinks this. It's because it's scary to think anything else. So of course he has to get to the idea that there's like Big Daddy in the sky that's created everything for our benefit, or at least with us as an intended purpose. Maybe he wouldn't say our benefit. And that we're the center of the universe, and that he's got our best interest in mind, and everything will be okay at the end, right? Like that's apparently comforting for him. So that's the conclusion he needs to get to. It doesn't matter if all of the steps there are completely disconnected from each other, and he doesn't consider any other possibilities as serious options. As long as we get to the conclusion, that's all that matters. And like you put just enough intellectual veneer up to make it seem like that there's some actual substance to this, when it's just all pure assertion and motivation.
And that gives life a whole lot of meaning, even if we go through struggles. And that's when people go through hard things. And those are the times, the hardest times are the times when we most need to be reminded of the truth of who we are and where we're going.
Amen. Love it. Love your work. Now, you're part of this movie coming up called The Story.
Yeah, you love his work because it confirms what you already believe. Like, there's no substance to this. I mean, I haven't read his full book, but look, you had 55 minutes, and that's the best you could give. I need to be getting to bed. That was somehow worse than I thought it would be. I thought we might actually get some argument as to why evolution was false, but like, we didn't. He just ignored almost all of the evidence for evolution, focused on one paper from 20 years ago that he hasn't followed up, which all by itself established is that most of the possible sequences of a particular protein, maybe that generalized to other proteins, but most possible sequences of this particular protein will not give rise to a functional fold. Only a very small subset will. What does that tell us about whether evolution is true? It tells us nothing about evolution. Even what I was talking about earlier on about the number of possible configurations that you would need to sample, even that is not directly relevant, because his paper doesn't address this. His paper doesn't address the question of how those spaces could have been sampled. It just addresses the question of what proportion of that space is functional. And he even acknowledges that the leading hypothesis is that you do it in a sort of stepwise fashion. You build up small components which have a little bit of function, then you combine them into bigger components that have a bit more function. You don't sample the whole space in like a one-by-one fashion, in a random fashion. That's what I said at the outset. You only get these huge probabilities if you assume it's like random and independent. But if it's bit by bit piecewise, it's not independent and it's not fully random. So his work doesn't say anything about the plausibility of molecular evolution. And that in itself wouldn't really tell you anything about evolution as a whole, because you might not know how this bit of evolution happened, but there could still be more than enough evidence in other areas to accept evolution, which there is, and he just completely ignored that. And even if you don't know how things evolved, even if evolution wasn't established or there was evidence against it, that would just leave you in a position of not knowing how things arrived. It wouldn't automatically mean that things were designed. You would need to explain why that's a better hypothesis, even though it seems like a designer would almost certainly not design things the way that they are. Why would a designer need to make an intricately folded protein for life to exist? Designer can just make life, like, what does that have to do with anything? It's just a huge assumption that the designer would bother to do it in this way, of all the possible ways he could do it. And then even if you assume that the universe is designed, it doesn't mean that the designer had to be a person. It could be any other range of things you could imagine, like a cosmic force, or like Brahman from Hindu philosophy. Or, there's versions of panpsychism, like, I've forgotten his name, like cosmopanpsychism, which believe like the universe has some sort of mind to it, but not necessarily a personal mind. It's like a radically different type of mind. Like, there's all sorts of ideas that people have posited about different ways that by which design could enter nature that have nothing to do with a personal God. And even if it was a personal God, that doesn't mean that he created us for a purpose. It could just be because he was bored, right? Like he did it just to amuse himself. You only get that with even more assumptions about the nature of God and how he interacts with things. So, it's all extremely clear that this is all, he told us, he didn't try to hide it. He told us at the outset that he started with not believing in evolution, or at least with having issues with it. And a major reason for that was because it sort of fit into a worldview where he didn't feel special and that life would eventually end and there was, no grand purpose behind it. So he told us that was the reason why he didn't like evolution. So then he decided to do a postdoc, or I guess PhD and then postdoc, trying to essentially disprove evolution. And he then came up with this essentially one paper. He published a few other things as well, but this is the main paper that he focuses on, which didn't show anything of the sort that evolution was false. It showed that there's this one particular open question: how did this molecular evolution happen? And now he's presenting that as if it somehow disproves evolution, which it absolutely does not. It doesn't even disprove molecular evolution, let alone the rest of evolution. And now he's just painted that with vague references to this design intuition that evidently people have, as if somehow this establishes the entire story that he started with at the outset. But it's sort of, in some way, it's all very clear. That was the whole exercise. The whole exercise was to try to feel intellectually secure and justified in this pre-existing belief that he already held evidently for emotional reasons, because he told us those reasons, right? I'm not psychologizing. He psychologized himself. I'm just putting together a few more of the pieces. So it's not surprising that the science and philosophy is terrible, because clearly that wasn't the point in the first place. The point was just to provide a veneer of intellectual support and maybe to sort of convince himself that all of this is justified and we don't have to feel silly in believing it, or you don't have to just take it on faith. So very disappointing video. Very little in the way of science there, and what science there was not explained and was misinterpreted. I'm just having a quick look at the comments, mostly just vacuous stuff like great conversation. It is difficult to understand why clever people hold on to evolution, which is mathematically impossible. This is what people think, that they think that this is shown that it's mathematically impossible. That's not even what Doug said, by the way. Doug said that it's extremely improbable, not mathematically impossible. So the laypersons even don't understand that distinction. But it's just very upsetting, because I value science and reasoning and philosophy when done well and rigorously, and when they can help us to understand the world better and remove misconceptions and things like that. But unfortunately, they're very often abused for these sorts of purposes. So maybe another time I'll review that stream where he did the Q&A, although I'm not optimistic that they'll get very good questions, because that just tends to be the way of things. But anyway, at least that was a bit cathartic for me and maybe provided you with some entertainment. So thanks everyone for listening. Oh, welcome Modern Atheism. I'm just about to sign off here. Just having a quick look at any of the last comments. We definitely created by someone or something. No getting around that. Well, yes, there was some process by which we were brought about. So we can all agree on that. Let's not lose sight of the fact that Axe literally misinterpreted his own paper. Yeah, I think that's the main takeaway, which doesn't surprise me. You remember I said before I looked at this paper, because I would have looked at that paper before if I'd realized that would be the entire basis of what he was going to talk about. But I didn't expect that, and so I didn't look into it. But I said, look, I don't think that 10 to the 77 number was in the paper, because it seems radically implausible that they would have gotten past peer review. It turns out it was in the paper, but the reason it got past peer review is because it doesn't mean what he was saying that it meant. It was just a calculation about probability space and sequence space that gives rise to function. It's not a probability of how likely it would have been, or how many sequences you would need to traverse, or how likely it would have been for evolution to have actually produced this protein. He's presenting it as if it's a probability of evolution being true or some component of it being true, but that's absolutely false. That is not what the number means in the paper. So that's how it got past peer review. It got past peer review by not being what he says it is. So absolutely dishonest. And his refusal to say anything about what other scientists think about how to answer this question, even though he references it in that paper, and there's been more work since then. That's incredibly telling, incredibly telling. I kind of hope someone asked about this in the Q&A, but I'm not holding my breath, because people usually focus on the wrong things and don't understand it. Anyway, yay atheism and naturalism, bless all. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. naturalism bless you all too. Thanks everyone for listening. Hopefully you found that interesting, and take care everyone. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.